In 2017, it became clear that the national government's land reform was being rolled out very poorly. In an attempt to find a scapegoat, the ruling ANC set out to change the constitution of South Africa by undermining the very part that protects any private property from being expropriated. Today, in order to get the support they need to change the constitution, the ruling ANC has been trying to team up with a radical and militant EFF by including custodianship, which involves nationalizing land, increasing state control, and sidelining the courts. This will allow the government to take any property, your car, house, or business, at any time, whether you're a South African citizen or a foreign investor. And you will only be able to dispute this in court after your property has been taken. Nationalizing land means that private property will become another state-owned enterprise, property of the state. South Africans have witnessed firsthand how the corrupt ANC government runs these enterprises into the ground. From the failing national airline to the energy provider that enforces rolling power cuts. This form of expropriation without compensation is undemocratic and will destroy South Africa's economy, plunging millions more into poverty. Many fear that South Africa, riddled with corruption, is headed down the dangerous path of Zimbabwe and Venezuela, where citizens face food shortages, poverty, and shocking inflation as a result of expropriation. The only way to truly empower all South Africans is to ensure that as many people as possible own their properties. Having a title deed means that citizens have an asset that can be used to secure a bank loan and be passed on to future generations. This is successful land reform, and it is already taking place where the DA governs. The DA-run Western Cape has a 72% success rate compared to national government's dismal 10% success rate nationwide. Trusts, like the Adama Workers' Trust, assist farm workers to have a stake in the business. The DA is helping farmers across South Africa get or keep ownership of their farms. A farmer from Limpopo, David Regase, waged an 18-year court battle and with the support of the DA finally secured ownership of his farm. Property rights are the cornerstone of democracy, and we cannot let South Africa go down this dangerous path of ANC and EFF state control.
Welcome to South Africa's largest online land summit, designed to interrogate the burning question of land. Proudly hosted by the DA, and today I am joined by my lovely co-host, Celia Brink.
Thanks, Siv, and it's great to be here. This will not just be another talk shop. We are bringing together experts, civil society organizations, members of parliament, interest groups, members of the media, and of course, ordinary South Africans who are joining us on various social media platforms. Our mission is to come up with actionable insights on the land question. We welcome your part of this conversation. Express your thoughts in the comments section and share this broadcast.
The land question is a deeply emotional and political one. It has often been used as a racial lightning rod when in actual fact, it deserves rational and national discussion.
So, to own land or not to own land, the ANC doesn't seem sure whether it wants ordinary people to own the title to their property. At their 2017 Congress, the ANC resolved to introduce legislation to amend the Constitution in order to make expropriation without compensation possible. They say they want to speed up land reform, but a closer look at the ANC's land reform record must surely convince everyone that the problem is not the Constitution, but the ANC itself.
And the ANC's land reform record is littered, as is everything else that they do, with corruption, nepotism, and bad management. It is criminal that in 27 years the ANC has done little to empower South Africans and have instead enriched themselves and those who are politically connected.
And as if the threat of expropriation without compensation is not enough, the ANC now wants to introduce the spectre of state custodianship, which essentially means nationalization.
And here's how it will work. In order for the ANC's constitutional amendment bill to pass, they need at least 2/3 majority in parliament. They don't have 2/3 majority, so they need other political parties to vote along with them.
So, Siv, the EFF has 44 seats in parliament, enough votes to get the ANC over the 2/3 line. But of course we know the EFF does nothing for free. In exchange for their votes, they want the ANC to go even further than expropriation without compensation. They want to make the state the custodian of all land in South Africa.
And here's the nub of the issue. This essentially means that no South African can own property. This has glaring similarities to the original sin of land dispossession, the 1913 Land Act. And this is the exact opposite of redress.
In today's summit, we'll unpack what these proposals mean for South Africa and what you can do to protect your right to own land.
Joined in studio today by Dr. Annelie Lotriet, who is our DA chairperson in the Parliamentary Caucus, but also a member of the Section 25 Committee, and Noko Masipa, who is our Member of Parliament. Annelie, let's get stuck into it. I know you've been leading the charge for the DA's fight against expropriation without compensation, but there are two separate processes to this. Can you explain to us what are the two processes and where are we at the moment?
Right. Good morning, Siviwe. Good morning, Noko, and good morning to all the viewers. Siviwe, yes, there's a lot of confusion, and I'm going to try to explain it quite simply. On the one hand, we have a constitutional amendment process, which in terms of the Constitution goes through a specific process. And also, as was said in the intro, it also requires a different threshold of approval in the Parliament. Then on the other hand, at the same time, we have the process to amend the Expropriation Bill. So that is not the Constitution. That could be seen as the law of general application, as is mentioned in Section 25. Okay. So it's two processes happening at the same time. But I think it's also important to understand that the worrying part is that any piece of legislation should meet constitutional muster. So what happens now is that Section 25 is being amended to include things that would make the expropriation bill possible and be possible to pass that muster.
Okay.
So our position is no, you don't amend the Constitution.
Yeah. And I mean, the very good point by Annelie. And Noko, I want to bring you in here. A number of people will say, our critics will say, if you're opposed to expropriation without compensation, then you are anti-redress. Why is this not true?
I think this is really being disingenuous to say that the DA is against expropriation or the land reform for that matter. In 2014, the DA government hosted one of the biggest land summits in the Western Cape in order to engage the civil society, the agri-sector, to see how best to move this land reform forward. And from that, what happened is that an organization called Pulse Initiative started gaining momentum in terms of assisting through the public-private partnership, where a number of initiatives were initiated in terms of the land reform process. This Pulse Initiative is based in Ceres, but it has already extended even to Free State and to Mpumalanga, where they are assisting farmers with the land reform process. And over and above that, the DA government in the Western Cape, they have built a public-private partnership whereby what happened is that the government applied to job funds. Through that job funds, they partnered with the private sector, and they also went into the commercial sector to raise the funding, where they started now helping with projects, which now, as I'm speaking now, they are able to even export their products through that particular initiative. At the moment, we're sitting in the Western Cape with the biggest public-private partnership funding of about 600 million that we have raised through the job funds in order to support many of the projects. So I'll say it is very disingenuous to say that, the DA is anti-land reform. We are an evidence-based organization. And what we are looking at the evidence, and we say, how do we solve these problems?
Yeah.
We are not interested in corruption. We are not interested in abusing the power to benefit those few that are elitist in our society.
Yeah.
And that's what we are against. About.
Absolutely.
So DA is definitely pro-land reform.
Sif, could I perhaps also just say that Noko, the DA in the Western Cape is leading the process, the most successful land reform projects, as you have explained now. So it is impossible to say that we are not the ones promoting land reform and redress. In fact, we are showing the way, how it can be done successfully.
And what would you then say to people who say, well, Section 25 is actually the hindrance to actual land reform?
Yes, and that's where it started at the 2017 ANC Congress, that land reform is not happening because of Section 25 and the whole issue of buying, willing seller, willing buyer. But that's not the truth. The Constitution, Section 25, makes provision for all land reform processes. It is merely now used as a scapegoat.
Is it?
Because it's the ANC trying to cover their own incompetence, the lack of political will. For 27 years, what have they done? It is fraught with corruption. So no, Section 25 was the easy way out at the Congress, and that would be now the panacea or the silver bullet for all land reform. So that is the furthest from the truth.
And Noko, I want to also bring you in here. I mean, there are clear reasons why the ANC has failed in the past 27 years. So, I mean, people have come up with reasons to say, like you mentioned, corruption, incompetence when it comes to generally understanding, having a land audit. All of these things are the reasons why there has been a clear failure. And you've been one of the people who've looked at what are some of those things.
Yeah. Let me just say something. It is important to really look at the Constitution and change it when it's really necessary. I take Constitution as a strategy of a country. So we say structure follows strategy. So if you have got a Constitution or you have a strategy and you don't have the right structure underneath, it's not going to function. You don't change the Constitution in order to effect a proper strategy, a proper structure. So what is happening now? The ANC, we know the failures. We've got evidence. We've got the numbers. We can tell in terms of the job. We can tell in terms of the poverty level. We can tell in terms of the economic meltdown, the junk status. But those are not as a result of the Constitution. Nothing is implicit in the Constitution to warrant that the Constitution needs to be changed. So I think that's the very first and most important point. So the failures of the ANC have led us to the constitutional amendment. And one of the things that, obviously, some of the things that I can just mention quickly is that the failures of the Land Bank is not a constitutional failure. The failure of the Honest Board biological product is not a constitutional problem. The failure of the Agricultural Research Council is not the failure of the Constitution. So those are the institutions that I can provide an example that, here they are failure. I mean, we know about the municipality failures. There's nothing that requires to be explicit to make sure that the people in the municipality are able to carry their functions.
Absolutely.
So the point I'm making is that the Constitution is not the problem.
And has never been the problem.
Has never been the problem.
And now we're in the parliamentary process, and we've seen the ANC needs, as we've said, the ANC needs a 2/3 majority to effect this change, not obviously the expropriation bill. And so there seems to have been some inconsistencies between the two of them. Perhaps their deal is now struggling a little bit. What are the two differences between the two of them, and where are we right now?
Okay, well, what happened is that at some point it seemed as if there was some difference between the ANC and the EFF, specifically with the issue of custodianship. Now, what happened in the committee was that the chairperson of the committee, Dr. Motshekga, said, but we have to look at the whole of Section 25, but that was not the mandate given to that committee. We had to focus on the bill that was sent for public comment. We had to focus on the specific mandate given by the National Assembly through a resolution. So things then started to go awry. They then decided on a process of bilaterals between the different parties. So the ANC had even bilaterals with the DA. We listened to them, but we stuck to our guns and said no amendment. The EFF and the ANC had bilaterals, and there was in the beginning some kind of an agreement, and then the ANC said, okay, we will include custodianship in the amendment, which we know is out of the mandate in any case. So they included custodianship. Well, there was a terrible outcry in the public, in our committee. They then again amended it to say custodianship of certain land. Now, who decides what is certain land?
And custodianship is effectively what? Nationalization, right?
Well, in effect, look, I don't think the ANC really understood what they mean by custodianship, because they said, no, it's just sort of looking after the land until it is transferred to someone, but that's not what the EFF in any case has in mind. So at this point, Siviwe, we're not quite sure. If you look at the media communication and debate between Floyd Shivambu and Minister Lamola, they're not yet at a point where they will reach agreement.
Yeah. And I just want to, I mean, before we wrap up, I just do want to do a quick follow-up. I mean, what is the danger, Annelie, for, why are property rights important? So what's the danger when we start tampering with this section, and where could we go wrong? Someone else might say, well, just leave them be, what does it matter anyway? Where's the danger for ordinary people watching at home? Where's the danger? Why should they be worried?
That's very important, Siviwe, because we were also asked, but why don't you just give in, agree to one or two minor changes? The problem is, this is part of the Bill of Rights. Your property rights is the cornerstone of a democracy and of an economy. So if you start tinkering with any section of the Bill of Rights, you're in trouble and you open the door. We don't want a party such as the ANC or the EFF to have a foot in the door in amending the Bill of Rights.
Absolutely. Now, God, tell me, I mean, if you, I always use my mother as a yardstick. If you had to say to her, what are the dangers of this, some of these amendments, and why is it important, particularly, for people who have been dispossessed of land in this country? Why is it important for people to have title to their own land? Why is that important? Because we've got a history of land dispossession in this country, and so why is this the antithesis of what should be happening?
Yeah, I think first, just to echo what my colleague has just said, the first thing that the ANC wanted to do was to remove the courts in this current bill. So when you remove the courts, you remove one of the three state institutions that are responsible for oversight. So technically, you're making, country ungovernable in a way in terms of the property rights. And secondly, they said land and improvement can be expropriated at a nil compensation. So now, once these things are done, you basically, tamper with the whole economy. So if you have got a title deed, at least in South Africa, you are still able to access to go to the bank and request for, let's say, overdraft or whatever, funding that you want to raise. So if that is taken away, you don't have that opportunity. We're sitting with problems now with regards to many of the farmers. The problems that they are sitting with, these farmers, is that they don't have the tenure of security in terms of the land that they are sitting with. They are not able to raise capital. Even the farmers that we assisted here in the Western Cape, they are not able to use their land as a security in order to secure funding. How we manage to get around that is that when they have got partnership with commercial farmers are able to go to the bank to raise capital to match the grant that they receive in the government. So the danger of now giving the state to own the land of the country, the state that is incapable, the state doesn't know even how many land are productive in this country. We know that the 90% of land that they have got are unproductive. They don't know. We were doing oversight. We were in Durban, we were at the port, we were at fresh produce market. Now to ask them a very simple question to say, what is the throughput in terms of the number of emerging farmers that you have supported that are using the port to export in Durban and the fresh produce to bring their produce? They don't have the numbers. So the ANC is working on a non-evidence base to support this expropriation of land without compensation, and which I think is very dangerous for the country, it's dangerous for the economy.
Absolutely. And seems to me that we're being led by rhetoric and not actually true empowerment, and which is for me the biggest tragedy in all of this, because people who really want redress and who want land ownership are being told, promised the sun and the moon, and it's never going to happen.
You're absolutely correct, and that is one of the things that we've been driving in the committee, is to ask those questions, to get it out into the public, to tell the real story of what the effect of this will be.
Absolutely. If you have just joined us, please stay on tuned, make some comments. We would love to hear from you. Members of the media, if you can just text us on the WhatsApp group, we will do our best to address some of your questions. Stay tuned. We've got a jam-packed program, some experts on the panels, some members of parliament, and really we start to unpack this real question in South Africa, the land question. We'll be back after this.
Cyril Ramaphosa has announced that the ANC will support the proposal to amend the constitution to expropriate land without compensation.
The expropriation bill was gazetted on the 9th of October, paving the way for expropriation of land without compensation, understandably making landowners anxious.
We need to unite and amend the constitution so that we can expropriate land without compensation.
The Constitutional Review Committee has adopted a final report to amend Section 25 of the Constitution. This is a step towards realizing expropriation of land without compensation.
The Constitution cannot be amended to facilitate confiscation as contemplated and remain a true constitution.
This could go all the way to the Constitutional Court to decide on the constitutionality of what Parliament has decided.
We will do everything that is necessary to ensure that people, all South Africans, property rights are protected, as was the intention with the Constitution.
It is here and it is here to stay. It is going to happen.
In the Eastern Cape, in the community of Guachu, many South Africans have lived and worked on these farms for most of their lives. Today, in democratic South Africa, they are denied the right to own property and are forced to be tenants of the state.
The biggest issue in this community is the transference of land to the people of Gwaju. We've been battling for so many years so that we can work on it, just like the previous farmers used to do. We want to use this land productively.
These South Africans have lived on this land for more than 90 years, and yet the promise of freedom has not materialized for them.
People are despondent. You know, they have lost hope. This issue of having the land of Gwaju transferred to the community is like a dream that will never come true.
The DA is working with the community of Gwaju to ensure that state-owned land is transferred to the people.
For my sake, for my family, for the community of Gwaju, I will never stop until we get the land transferred to this community.
Property rights are enshrined in our Constitution. Section 25 guarantees that nobody may be arbitrarily deprived of their property. It also stipulates that expropriation may only happen subject to compensation. Compensation must be agreed on or decided by a court of law with reference to objective criteria. Section 25 also tasks the state with taking reasonable steps to enable citizens to gain access to land on an equitable basis. Does Section 25 stand in the way of land reform? Is it necessary to amend the Constitution to allow for land expropriation without compensation? Our guests for this section are among South Africa's best legal minds on this issue. I'm joined in studio by DA Members of Parliament Advocate Glynis Breitenbach, Dr. Mimi Gondwe and Werner Horn. And on Zoom, we're joined by Martin van Staden, a legal fellow with Sakeliga, and Dr. Anthea Jeffrey, Head of Policy Research with the SA Institute of Race Relations. Thank you very much. Dr. Jeffrey, I want to start with you, Dr. Anthea Jeffrey from the Institute of Race Relations. Your analysis of public policy in South Africa depends a great deal on the ANC's National Democratic Revolution. And given that, Anthea,
so I can't even
how did we end up in our constitutional dispensation with Section 25, this formulation of property rights in our Constitution, if the ANC is now opposed to it? Just give us a bit of a background of how we ended up with this property clause.
To think back to the situation as it existed in 1994 to 1996, when the final constitution was being negotiated and agreed. And at that point, it was very important for the ANC to reassure South Africans that it was full of reasonable people, that there would be a prosperous economy to look forward to. And therefore, it was important to it to provide reassurance on property rights because they are so crucial to economic success. We, at the same time, have a property clause that is weaker than that found in many other countries, and it's full of ambiguous terms. So I think there was also an expectation on the part of the ANC that the new constitutional court, which had been established, in which people like Arthur Jaskelson and R.B. Sachs were, for example, playing an important role, could interpret some of that rather uncertain wording in ways that would advance the NDR. What was also highly relevant was what Ngako Ramatlori said in 2011, that at the time the Soviet Union had recently collapsed in 1991, and that the ANC was therefore forced to make compromises and to agree to things that it might not otherwise have agreed to. But it did so, of course, knowing that the NDR is an incremental strategy. If you agree to property rights now, you get the entire 1996 constitution put into place. And it has many other provisions useful to the NDR, such as socioeconomic rights and horizontal application, so that you can make the Bill of Rights binding on companies, for example. And once you attain that beachhead, you can continue to move forward with the NDR. In time, the balance of forces will change. And then if you still need to, you will amend the Constitution. But in fact, we've already seen a considerable weakening of the words of it through the Constitutional Court, and most notably in the decision in Agri-SA case in 2013, when Chief Justice Mogoeng effectively drew a distinction between expropriation and custodianship and has opened the way for the provisions that we now see in the Constitutional Amendment Bill.
Glynis, so whatever the motives of the ANC were in the formulation of the Constitution and how things have changed subsequently, we now have the Section 25, the property clause, and its formulation. And it's part of a particular section of the Constitution called the Bill of Rights. Tell us why it is so very dangerous to start tinkering with any Bill of Rights.
Well, Celia, the Constitution is the bedrock of our constitutional democracy. It forms the very foundation of our constitutional society. The Bill of Rights, Chapter 2 of the Constitution, and it's no accident that it's in Chapter 2, it's very, very important. The Bill of Rights is the embodiment of the social compact that we entered into in 1994, all South Africans. To tinker with the Bill of Rights, to manipulate it, to amend it for politically expedient reasons, is to endanger that social compact. And that's a very dangerous thing. And it leads to places where we don't want to go. And it will destroy property rights in this country. It will destroy our economy. It will destroy us. And for that reason, we cannot allow the Bill of Rights to be tinkered with. And specifically not now when it's not necessary.
Mimi, I want to bring you in here. If the ANC and the EFF do come together and they succeed in changing Section 25, that's what we have now. They succeed in changing that by the process that they have followed. What is going to be the implication for this idea of the rule of law, of laws being determined by principles instead of the whims of men and women?
Thank you very much for that question, Celias, and greetings to everybody watching this. Let me start from Chapter 1 of our Constitution, which contains our founding provisions. So it basically stipulates that our Constitution is founded upon a number of principles, including the rule of law and the supremacy of the Constitution. And then Section 2 of Chapter 1 has a whole section that is dedicated to articulating, this principle of the supremacy of the Constitution. So it says the Constitution binds everybody, and, everybody is bound to the obligations that are imposed by the Constitution.
Including the state, of course.
Including the state.
Especially.
Including all organs of state, including the three arms of government, the legislative arm, even the legislative arm that is trying now via the Section 25 Constitution to amend the Constitution and do away with property rights as we know them. Janice just touched on that point. And then, of course, we've got Section 25, which says that expropriation may only be done in terms of law of general application. And as you indicated at the opening of the segment, it also states that there has to be compensation, and that has to be just and equitable. And then Section 25 goes a little further and then says that, the amount of compensation and the time and the manner, as you indicated as well at the beginning of the segment, may be agreed to between the parties or may be, decided upon by a court. And so what this amendment tries to do effectively, Celias, is a number of things. As Glennis mentioned, it tries to do away with property rights as we know them by not requiring compensation, by wanting all land to be placed under custodianship, which you and I know is just another way of saying all land should be nationalized. And also it tries to restrict access to courts by individuals. And that's very dangerous, Celias, because you cannot have the legislature now trying to dictate to courts what matters it can and cannot, hear.
And here you're obviously referring to the later suggestion that the roles of the court in determining whether compensation is feasible should be taken out.
Exactly. And that's what the latest amendment tries to do. Now, going back to the rule of law, the rule of law is an internationally recognized principle. It's recognized even by some of our trading partners, such as, the US. And you know that we have the AGOA Act, which enables trade between the US and certain countries in Africa, duty-free.
Gives us access to those important US markets.
And the Biden administration has, affirmed its commitment to the rule of law. And then the question becomes, what happens to trade agreements now that we're moving away from the rule of law and considering this amendment that seeks to undermine the rule of law? And research has shown that there's a correlation between the rule of law and factors such as an accountable government, and a government that respects and goes out of its way to preserve and protect and safeguard individual rights and freedoms, including, the right to property. And it's also a principle that says that government authority may only be exercised within certain confines, and those confines are determined by what? By the law. And
in essence, it's a tapestry that once you start unstitching one part, you risk it unraveling completely.
Pull the whole thing apart,
Martin van Staden, I want to come to you. Based on what you know about constitutions and rights-based societies, why is private property rights so essential to the broader concept of freedom in a society such as ours?
Well, I think the first thing we need to bear in mind is that all of the rights in the Bill of Rights, even the socioeconomic rights, assume a strong proprietary base to make sense. You don't have a right to housing if the house is owned by the state and you can be evicted at any moment based on arbitrary political considerations. But more than that, as citizens, we depend fundamentally on our material foundations, which is our property, our assets, to participate meaningfully in matters of governance. If we are dependent on the state for handouts because we cannot provide for our own sustenance, we will never fulfill the roles that a true citizen, rather than a subject of politicians, must play in a constitutional democracy, because simply you will never bite the hand that feeds you, even if that hand is corrupt or oppressive. Now, in the same way, civil society institutions will be undermined, even political parties like the DA or even the EFF. The press, for instance, cannot rely on government to print its papers or store online content on its servers. Civil rights organizations that often take the government to court will similarly have trouble carrying on its business if the very property that they are housed in is owned by the government. So private property is crucial to ensuring that there is a balance of power between government and civil society, because fundamentally that is what constitutionalism means. It means that the government is put in a box, essentially, and that civil society actually has an upper hand in power relations. But what the Constitution 18th Amendment Bill really does is it reconceptualizes constitutional democracy and tries to elevate the government far higher above citizens, above civil society, so that government becomes a controller of our ability to provide for ourselves. And I mean, this is important. I know a lot of people are going to say, but Martin, poor South Africans who formed a great majority of our people don't have property. Now, the point is, all of those people want property, and for South Africa to become a mature democracy, we need to keep this institution of private property safe. We cannot now destroy it and guarantee that for all time to come, South Africa will remain a poor country governed arbitrarily by people only interested in power. We need to keep the door open for those who have been deprived of property to acquire private property and become meaningful participants in governance.
And Martin, what strikes me about this whole issue is that land reform becomes a meaningless concept if there isn't proprietary interest by ordinary people, as you identified. You can't have land reform without strong private ownership rights.
Yeah, Yeah, no, that's exactly correct. One of the things that struck me very early on during the debate on so-called expropriation without compensation was that when you accept this principle, I mean, then you can you can give ownership to farms, to houses, to anything, to any number of people, but there will always be this sword hanging over their heads that there will be someone else who will now benefit, because government can come in the middle of the night and say your property, which you received yesterday as part of a redistribution program, has been identified for the next redistribution program, and now it will be taken from you without any compensation and given to a political cater who has been identified there. So effectively, the Constitution 18th Amendment Bill, as it stands right now, with a specific reference to the confiscation principle, EWC, and the custodianship principle, nationalization, is that Section 25 will be rendered entirely meaningless. It will be a useless part of our Constitution if this bill, this constitutional amendment bill, is adopted. Nothing, the land reform provisions in it will completely lose their content, because even if you receive a farm, even if you receive a house or some tenured security, there will always be the threat that government can take it without paying you, and thereby take your livelihood, your home, the very thing that you use to provide for your own sustenance for that of your family, away from you. And no, there is no constitutional democracy in the world, at least no successful constitutional democracy in the world, where this is the case. Every successful society in the world has a proprietary base. There are various forms of limitations, but fundamentally, the most successful countries, the most successful political democracies have strong property rights underlying them, and the state is always required to pay compensation upon expropriation. It's only when you have been, when your property has been used in a criminal offense and you have been found guilty of that offense in a court of law, or if your property has been attached by a court in a civil matter to settle a debt or a delict. It is only in those circumstances when property in a healthy constitutional democracy can be taken from you without compensation. Our government is trying to turn expropriation into a tool of punishment and into a tool of political convenience, and thereby undermine South Africa's prospects as a constitutional democracy very fundamentally.
Now, Martin, you referred there to folks who live with a sword over their heads, being tenants of the state, effectively. And later on, we're going to speak to one of those people, David Ragase, who the DA has been able to assist. But Anthea, I just want to bring you back into the conversation. What would you say to the argument that is often made, sometimes half-heartedly, and even accepted by some commentators, that the changes now being proposed to the Constitution only seek to make explicit what is already implicit, namely that in certain circumstances, so-called zero compensation can be awarded in instances of expropriation? What would you say to that argument?
I think it's become increasingly spurious over time. That was certainly the mandate given to the ad hoc committee, that it must make explicit what is already implicit in Section 25. And that's not what it's done, particularly in the latest version of the 18th Constitution Amendment Bill. There is nothing in Section 25 to sanction state custodianship of land. So introducing that provision now is certainly going way beyond what is implicit in Section 25. And in addition, Section 25, with all its emphasis on striking an equitable balance between the public interest in land reform and the interests of the expropriated owner, is fundamentally opposed to the idea of no compensation being anything but the most exceptional instance, that no compensation could only be possible where the property in issue genuinely has no market value. For example, if it's depleted mining land, so sort of underpinned by a warren of tunnels that it can't be used for any purpose without costly remediation. There you might legitimately say that no compensation can be paid for something that has no value. But in every other instance, what you have to do in terms of our Constitution is to strike this equitable balance. And the government is trying to circumvent that, and particularly through the custodianship provisions, also by allowing no compensation for improvements. because even if there was some argument about land having been dispossessed in the past, in general, improvements will have required a considerable outlay of money, of work, of risk-taking entrepreneurship in many instances. There will not have been any question of dispossession of people from those improvements, and yet there is to be no compensation for the improvements too. And this, as Martin was saying, goes so contrary to the whole idea that you might need expropriation rarely in the interests of land reform, but it puts a very heavy burden on those landowners whose land is then taken in order to meet the needs of the land reform program. And in order to try and deal fairly with those particular individuals on whom the burden of land reform now falls, you must at least make sure that they receive adequate compensation. It's the least that can be done if you're to strike an equitable balance as the Constitution requires. So to argue that the bill that we have now simply makes explicit what is implicit in the Constitution is really just, it's hot air, it's not true.
Anthea, I want to get back to you about banks and bonded properties, but Glynis, Anthea mentioned something important here, is that this original proposal to change Section 25 has gone through so many changes that we're not even quite sure that we've had proper notice as the South African public about what the ANC and the Section 25 committee intends to do.
Well, you know, Celia, I don't think that the ANC in the Section 25 committee know what they want to do. They've changed, they've moved from point A to point wherever they are now so many times. Each time the committee meets, their position changes. That's why I said in the beginning this is a politically expedient amendment. They're determined to amend something, regardless of the effect. They have little regard for the effect that it's going to have on the economy, on property rights, on the massive devaluation that this will have on property and the effect that will have on just the banking sector. So they're determined to make some sort of amendment so that they can go to their electorate and say, we've amended Section 25.
Instead of actually doing something about land reform.
And this place where we started, as Anthea said, to make explicit what is implicit. We're so far from that now that she's quite right. This is just hot air. It's a nonsense. And I honestly don't think that the ANC know what they want to do. They're pandering now to the EFF in some desperate scramble. But they change their position almost in every sitting. It's very hard to keep up with what their position is, and I think if you ask them today what their position is, they wouldn't be able to tell you.
And when this is challenged in court, if it ever gets there, I mean, these are important details. Did you follow the important process in trying to change the Constitution?
If this thing goes the distance, there's no doubt that it will get to court, and there's no doubt that the process has not been followed.
Silas, if I could just come in as well at this point. And what Glynis is saying right now is very important, because when we had the bilaterals with the ANC, because at some point they requested all the parties to be, to avail themselves for bilaterals, where we could see where we could meet each other halfway. And we were not moving from our position. We said Section 25 is fine the way it is, and it's not an impediment to land reform, let alone equitable access to land. And I remember one of the ANC participants during the bilateral saying, please try and meet us halfway, because we want to be seen as if we're doing something about the land issue. So there was this desperation on their part, and that's why I think they've relented to the custodianship, that the EFF wants. And
meet us halfway, but they don't know where they're going.
Exactly.
Who knows
exactly. And what Glynis is also saying about them, speaking from, both sides of the mouth. You've got, the ad hoc committee saying that we want to nationalize, certain pieces of land, and then you've got the president saying that no, that's not the way we're going to go. He's reassuring investors and saying no, that's not the form of expropriation without compensation we want. And that is exactly what if you remember when the idea to actually expropriate land without compensation was announced by the ANC after the elective conference, and Godongwana was the one who actually briefed the media on it, and he was saying that they wanted it to be done in a sustainable way, in a way that it wouldn't have a negative impact on
the economy and
any sector, the agricultural sector, the banking sector, which, by the way, is very timid about what is happening right now. They've hardly said anything. We hear a lot of voices from the agricultural sector, etc. And then we have the president speaking to that and saying, no, it's going to be done in a sustainable manner, in a manner that will not threaten food security, etc., and trying to reassure investors. And then you have someone by the name of Vusumusi Gaba, who sits on the ad hoc committee, saying that, what Annelies said earlier, that it would be temporary custodianship,
So confused, but I want to get back to the banking sector and what Mimi described as their timidity, Anthea. You'd think that given the stake of the banks in bonded properties, they would fight in the front lines against the dilution of property rights. Why have they been so timid, do you think, Anthea?
Well, I think all that one can say in their defense is that it's a difficult issue because the success of a banking system depends on public confidence in it. And I think that behind the scenes, they have made it very clear to the ad hoc committee, the Constitutional Review Committee before it, that there is a very great deal of people's savings that have been used to extend mortgages to homeowners, to farmers, to people up and down the country who need loans for business purposes. And people's savings will not be safe if the state then takes custodianship or ownership of land. And suddenly the collateral which used to secure those loans is no longer there. People no longer have the assets which they relied on. They still have the debts to pay. Somehow, if you're a homeowner and you've lost your home, but you still have a mortgage with the bank, you have to keep on paying that mortgage, even though you now don't have a home. And you've got to try and find another home, and you didn't get any compensation for the home you've lost. Obviously, you can't do that. So obviously, the bank actually cannot bring in that loan. It will, in the end, have to write off that loan. It will cause a tremendous concern among the public as a whole, even before any of this happens, if they think the savings that they put with the banks are not safe, that those savings have been lent out already, will continue to be lent out if we don't want to bring the economy to a halt. And yet, if the government then takes custodianship or ownership, it will not be possible for people to repay their loans, and their savings will become very unsafe in the hands of the banks. It's the sort of thing that can trigger a panic, a bank run, the kind of global financial crisis that began in the US with the subprime mortgages. So you can understand why the banks don't want to go too heavily into the public arena.
Does make sense.
But
indeed.
I think that they are very much making these points strongly, I hope, not only to the committee, but also to important ministers and to the government as a whole, that if we do not want to have a Zimbabwean outcome, you must preserve the sanctity of the banking system. If we don't want hyperinflation and a 95% unemployment rate, which it may take us longer to get to than it did Zimbabwe because we're a stronger economy in many ways, but you have to preserve your financial system. It's part of the backbone of a functioning economy.
Werner Horn, I want to bring you into the conversation, looking at the issue of land claims, land restitution process. So obviously we hope, Werner, that the ANC and the EFF don't in fact reach agreement at all, but especially not on the EFF's position of complete state custodianship of all land. But just to understand the implications of these policy proposals, Werner, what happens to unsettled land restitution claims if the state becomes the custodian of all land?
Yeah, thanks, Sahir, and good morning to everyone. Yeah, I think firstly one must reflect a bit about what state custodianship actually is.
Please do.
And other speakers has referred to the fact that it is, legally speaking, a very loose term at the moment. the ANC says we can give fresh content to the term of state custodianship, which will be a softer version. But the version of the 18th Amendment Bill, which was published, did not attempt in any way to give content to the term state custodianship. And as long as that is the case, then of course one has to go back to the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act of 2002, where this term was first introduced into our law.
Yes.
And with the Agri-SA case to which Dr. Anthea has referred, in which the court ultimately dealt with the term. And I think there the warnings of the minority judgment is something we must be mindful of when we talk about state custodianship. Judges van der Westhuizen and Vroeneman actually, in as many words, said that this is the introduction of a term absent of thorough legal examination of the concept itself. At the time, the term abolishment of private ownership of mineral resources were used, which is, of course, just another way of saying expropriation without compensation. And in that minority judgment, they sounded the warning, and that, obviously looking back now, we should all have heeded the warning at the time that in the way private ownership of mineral resources was abolished, it will eventually open up the door for the same abolishment of private ownership of land. So that's unfortunately where we are. We can't, absent of a different definition of what is meant by state custodianship, we can't give any other content to it than it's just yet another name for state ownership of land. It is, of course, so that the EFF in its founding manifesto actually quoted verbatim from that specific Agri-SA case and said this is what should have happened to all land.
Which makes it so very important, Werner, to avoid that term entirely. And I think why the DA has absolutely refused to settle on an issue like this.
Well, absolutely, and which of course is a clear indication of how the ANC, typical of its ways, are disingenuous with South Africans if it says, but state custodianship is temporary holdership of land. There's just no legal basis to argue that will ever be the case. But coming to your question around land restitution and distribution, of course, all of this is aimed at firstly land redistribution or restitution, is aimed at restoring the rights people held previously and which they lost because of the operation of racist and apartheid laws. And the aim of that has always been to restore ownership. It is, of course, so that the majority of claimants settled for monetary compensation. And interestingly, the Minister of Land Affairs and Land Reform, Toko Didiza, when she appeared in front of the ad hoc committee, actually admitted to the committee that in itself is becoming a problem to government, because until the percentage of black owners of land is changed, there will simply never be a way in which government can say we've succeeded. So that monetary compensation aside, the aim of restitution and land redistribution has always been to give ownership. And if you now go to a situation where the state becomes the custodian or the owner or whatever you want to call it of all land, then of course that whole activity will be wiped out with one single law being passed. Others have spoken passionately about how one needs ownership ultimately to be able to tap into the economic potential of land, so one can have that discussion. But the reality is that for everyone who had that painful experience, them or their family in the past of losing rights to land, this whole issue of state custodianship actually says to them, despite your suffering, we're embarking on a new road where you will be no better off than when the apartheid government just...
And please, those people who've received title deeds must now give them back. I mean, that's essentially what everyone who's received title after 1994, the title becomes worthless if the state becomes the custodian of land. Bringing us back to this idea that without private property rights, land reform itself, the concept becomes meaningless.
And it removes any hope that those people have of ever righting the wrongs of the past.
Yes.
They have no hope of ever having access to land in perpetuity.
So, Martin, I want to close off with you. You've heard how the political confusion, the opportunism, the mistakes around the amendment process has brought us to this point where there seems to be almost a political stalemate. It's like, you know, watching a 9-year-old with a 9mm. You know, it's a process of complete incompetence that threatens the entire constitutional order. Just if we go back then to the Constitution and the requirement that the state must take reasonable legislative and other steps to expand the base of ownership of people, what should government do? What could it have done under the Constitution to meet this obligation instead of trying to change Section 25 itself?
Yeah, so our constitution is very unique in the world in that it doesn't simply say people's property rights are protected. It says that property rights must be actively advanced. So it's actually, I would say, one of the strongest property rights provisions in the world if you have a proper constitutionalist approach to it. Now, as the constitution currently stands, it requires the government to bring about security of tenure for tenure that is insecure. So here you think of people living in townships on the periphery of our cities, where they are mostly tenants of the municipality, whereas according to the Constitution and according to a 1991 Act of Parliament, they have become owners, in fact.
And this is when councils and so on hand out title deeds to people. That's the
Yes.
wrong that's being corrected there.
Yes, so that's what government should be doing. The ANC and its council specifically is that they should be expediting this process of getting title deeds to these people who are owners, but who in de facto only have the rights and entitlements of tenants. And that's an injustice that the government can quite easily overcome. It could turn millions of plots around the country into real homes. It will turn dead capital into live capital. That's one thing. The other thing is that various government departments, organs of state, provincial governments, municipal governments all around the country own vast amounts of land. Some of this is considered private land because it's the private property of the municipality or of the university, which skews the land audits considerably. Now, the next solution is that a lot of this property is simply unused or underutilized, and sometimes the government department doesn't even know that it owns that land. It's imperative that that property should be given, even for free, to deserving families, whether they can farm or not. If they can put the land to some kind of use, live on it, build a house, farm something else, give it to them so that we can make of South Africa a property-owning country. And then another thing is that the government has actively undermined property rights, and that is something it can stop because the Constitution requires government to expedite equitable access to land. Now, two of these things, one thing is the Subdivision of Agricultural Land Act and proposed changes by the ANC, which will make that even worse, is that it stops agriculturalists from subdividing their land into smaller, more affordable plots and perhaps selling that to aspiring up-and-coming farmers. That's illegal if you don't have the Minister of Agriculture's permission. So get rid of that. You're not an owner of your property if you're not allowed to subdivide it. Get rid of that entirely. And then the other thing is our RDP program. One of the good stories to tell after the end of apartheid, where millions of South Africans now have houses and roofs over their heads. The problem is they have, when you get an RDP house, it comes with, according to the Housing Amendment Act of 2001, a preemptive clause, which disallows you to sell your own property, your house that you own, for a period of 8 years. Now, what has happened is South Africans have still sold the property informally on the black market, because if you get a job offer in Cape Town and you're unemployed in Johannesburg, you're not going to stick around because your house is here. You're going to move there, but you're not allowed to sell it. So it's been sold on the black market. And that is insecure tenure for the person that has been sold to, and you have committed a crime. So you are now a criminal because you have sold your own property. So we need to get rid of preemptive clauses. The poor should not be condescended to. If you give someone property or if someone acquires property, they should have the same rights as someone who is wealthy, someone who has owned property their whole lives. We cannot discriminate against the poor in this way and just assume that they will throw everything away for a quick buck. That is extremely condescending and should be stopped. So the bottom line is, government needs to step out of the way. It needs to stop undermining land reform by itself. It needs to stop undermining property rights by itself. That's the most important thing. And I mean, get rid of the idea of expropriation without compensation, custodianship, to start that off with. And then the second thing is, government has property that it needs to transfer in ownership to deserving South Africans. And this is all possible, indeed required, by the Constitution as it currently stands. But government has dilly-daddled around that for many decades. And now it is trying to create this distraction from its own failure to engage in land reform by saying that the Constitution itself is somehow the impediment. And now we are playing with fire, because as has been said now on this panel, the moment we open this door, not for a good constitutional or democratic reason, but simply for the political convenience of the governing party, if we open the door to amending a right and destroying a right in the Constitution, this is going to be a roller coaster that no one wants to ride. So we need to nip this in the bud and require that government stick to what the Constitution currently empowers and requires it to do, because it's really an empowering provision in the Constitution, and it has a lot of untapped potential.
Well, there you have it. The things that government can do and has to do that does not involve changing the Constitution and rewriting Section 25. You are watching the Land Summit hosted by the Democratic Alliance. If you want to help make a difference, like and share. We'll be back right after this.
Ons is vandag hierso in Northern, in Limpopo, op die plaas van David Regasse.
Ek het in die plaas die 1 April 1991 ingekom. Dan die 1 April van hierdie jaar was 30 jaar.
Ek het vir David ontmoet in 2015. Hy het 'n huurooreenkoms met die staat aangegaan waar die huurooreenkoms gesê het hy kan die grond koop as hy sou wou. Op daai stadium met die ANC-regering hulle beleid verander en hulle het gesê geen swart boer in Suid-Afrika kan meer titelakte van hulle grond kry nie, hulle mag net huurders wees.
As jy hier, jy kan nie mooi beplan nie, aangesien jy weet, jy kan enige tyd by die einde van jou kontrak kom en jy verloor die plekke, jy moet uitgaan. Maar as jy eienaar is, jy kan beplan, jy kan alles verbeterings doen, jy kan bou, dis 'n belegging vir ewig.
In 2014-15 toe hy my ontmoet het, het hy reeds moed opgegee dat die grond nooit in sy naam oorgedra sal word nie.
Ek het nou begin met hulle skakel. Waar is die koopkontrak? Hoekom finaliseer u dit nie? Dan het dit nie geantwoord. Dit was 'n baie swaar situasie waar ek in gelewe het.
Die probleem is dat die ANC-regering eensydiglik het hulle dit net gestop en vir boere gesê julle kan nie meer eienaar raak van jou grond nie, en ons het die staat hof toe gevat en verlede week het hy uiteindelik die titelakte ontvang vir sy grond. So ons is vandag hier om saam met David en sy gesin fees te vier, bly te wees.
Ek is baie bly. Dit wil sê ek gaan nou begin met die boerdery.
Meneer Regasse is een van die eerste boere met wie ek begin werk het jare gelede. Vandag het ons hierso boere van Mpumalanga, ons het boere van Gauteng. Ek is besig met boere in die Oos-Kaap, met boere in KwaZulu-Natal, met boere in die Wes-Kaap.
Die boere in al die provinsies wat soos ek gesukkel het, hulle moet gehelp word.
Die DA beklei nie net vir mense wat nie eienaarskap het nie, maar ons beklei ook vir mense wat reeds eienaarskap het, sodat dit nie maklik gemaak kan word vir die regering om van jou bates te kom vat nie. Ek wil vir die boere van Suid-Afrika sê, moenie moed opgee nie. Daar is hoop. Ons moet mekaar net kry, ons moet mekaar vind, kontak ons. Ons sal seker maak dat as jy die persoon is wat op jou grond wil boer, wat jou nageslag wil sien boer op jou grond, sal ons seker maak dat ons die veg vir jou saam met jou veg.
My oupa het geboer, my pa het geboer, ek ook boer, en ek hoop my kinders sal ook boer. Ek voel baie, baie bly.
One Sunday afternoon, I came home and two people accosted me. At first, I thought they were some friends playing a practical joke, but they weren't. They were after guns and money. I had neither. They didn't believe me, and for 3 hours, they were very vicious indeed to me. It is astoundingly difficult to get over this stuff, and no farmer is ever safe. We have burglar guards on our houses, we have panic buttons, we have radios. We have had poor support of the policing system and the judiciary in the last 20 years. I knew that this would be difficult, but I am prepared to do it because I want things to change. The idea that the DA doesn't support farmers is just ludicrous. The DA supports farmers and supports farming.
Expropriating land without compensation has various devastating elements to it, the most fundamental of which being the threat to food security. Today in South Africa, being a farmer or a fruit producer is not only dangerous, but increasingly unsustainable. Nobody wants to invest in any asset that can be smashed and grabbed by the state overnight. This directly impacts the farming community, the agricultural sector, and the millions of jobs they support. As the recent unrest in KwaZulu-Natal demonstrated, food security is the bedrock of any country. It affects everyone, from the farmer to the distributor, the truck driver, the shopkeeper, and any ordinary consumer like you and me. In studio today, I'm joined by dear members of Parliament Thandeka Mbabama and Annette Steyn. We're also joined on Zoom by farmers Dr. David Rakhatse and Mr. Peter Swart, as well as Thembakazi Macheke from the Gwatyu community. Thank you very much, Annette and Thandeka, for joining me, and thank you to Peter and Dr. Rakhatse for joining me on Zoom. Let's get right into it. Annette, the proposed amendments are going to have significant impact on the agricultural sector and the farming community. What are some of the things that the sector needs to be aware of as we're looking at these proposed constitutional amendments?
Yeah. So, I think our farmers know exactly what it is, especially farmers like Mr. Rakhatse and also Thembakazi from Gwatyu. When they don't have security or ownership, to live on the land. I think we will also speak to Mr. Agase a bit later of his fight and the change that ownership or the fact that he now is the owner of his land is having on them. I'm getting calls from farmers all over South Africa on a constant basis to say, please, please, we need to at least get a lease agreement to understand that, you know, I can make a loan or I can plant. Agriculture is a very, very expensive output. And for people to put something in the ground that don't even know it will grow because of the weather, there's rain, there's hail, there's floods, there's drought, and now not even know if they will be on the land in the next year to harvest. It is a massive, massive thing for them. People need security. People need to know that if I have this output, I will be able to harvest and get an income next year.
Thandeka, I want to bring you in here. I mean, you are serving on the same portfolio, and Annette talks a lot about the security of tenure. What does that mean? What is the value of the security of tenure for somebody in the farming community, in the agricultural sector? What does that practically mean for them?
Thank you, Siviwe. I want to start off by saying that tenure security is a right that is enshrined in the Constitution, Section 25(6). And for the EFF to think that they can remove that and get the state as to give the state custodian of all the land, custodianship of all the land, is really taking us back. Myself, as a person who has not had in the past, you know, I have not been able to buy property in the past, I feel that I would like to have my title deed. And I think everybody out there feels that way. Now, when it comes to tenure security, you have different types of tenure security. You have tenure security with your title deed. And that title deed opens up a lot of doors.
Yeah.
Number one, you can go to the bank and you can get a loan from the bank with that title deed. Because as Annette said, farming is a very risky business. And you do have to have that safety net of credit that you can always tap into as a farmer. Secondly, having in your household an asset, like a house, like a farm, etc., etc. That is a good thing. It's an emotional thing. I worked with farmers in the land bank, and I could see that they are emotionally attached to the land. And because they were emotionally attached to the land, you found out that they cared for the land. You know, you wouldn't find different ways of like overcropping and things like that. The farmers would take care of the land because they know this is my piece of ground and I'm going to hand it over to my children. So my second point is that if you have that title deed, you can create household wealth.
Absolutely.
Generational wealth that you can pass on to your children. And then also, when it comes to tenure security, if you don't have tenure security, you are at risk of being evicted at any given moment. Whether it's a landlord, another farmer, government itself, you just don't have that security.
Yeah.
And you'll find that some farmers, you know, it takes a very experienced and a farmer who's been in it for a long time, because I see it happening in the States, where people don't have security of tenure and they can still make the business work for them. But I think in South Africa, we're not ready for that. We need to feel that this is my piece of ground and I will work on it.
Yeah.
So the farmer must have that tenure security. Tenure security also goes to the people out in the rural areas.
Yeah.
It's not only about the farmers. People in the rural areas also need tenure security because the same rule applies. They still want to hand over that house to their children, etc., etc. So for the ANC and the EFF to think that they can, you know, take us back to not having our own property, it's really, as somebody said, very disingenuous of them.
Absolutely.
If I can just add on that quickly, Siv, I also explain to people the importance. People know when you're renting somewhere or you're shacking somewhere or you're just staying in someone's house for a while, you're not going to improve there.
Yeah.
If you're renting a house, you're not going to build a new bathroom or put in new walls or extend the roof or do any big investment on that. And that is what 10-year security means. You know that when you put in some extra improvements in your place where you are, it will stay yours, but you won't do it if it's not yours.
Exactly. But and also, Annette, just quickly, I mean, we, as Thandeka says, we've got a history of land dispossession in this country, and now we are being taken back where we're saying that people can't have the dignity of owning something.
Yeah. You know, I've been researching and learning, about the history of the country. And not even long ago, in the 1800s, late 1800s, black South Africans were owners of the land, farmland. And then there was a lot of legislation, I'm speaking even before 1913, that people had to, buy through their chiefs or their clans and all of that. So now that people, for the first time, black South Africans become owners of the land, we are changing that back. I would have been very, very angry with the lies that the ANC government is telling us, and we're going out to people and explaining, and more South Africans want title of their land. They understand title and what it means, especially in the way that I explained it. If you have to have improvements on your property, in your house or anything, you can only do that when you're an owner.
Absolutely.
And who's to say that, the ANC says they have a basket of solutions. But who's to say, in that basket of solutions, how are they going to choose if you are going to have a title deed and I won't? Exactly. How is that going to happen?
Exactly.
And in all this, everything that they're telling us, they don't actually go into the how.
Exactly. And I mean, people like Peter, I want to bring you in here. Somebody like Peter, you are a farmer, and you are hearing all these proposed amendments. And so what does that practically mean for you and the value of what you do for a business? Is it even worth it? Is it worth continuing in the farming and in the agricultural sector at this point?
No, look, we've got nowhere else to go. So we always have solutions as farmers. But just to give you an example, the farm next to me was bought the other day for 50,000 Rand a hectare, which is a huge amount in our area because the farm was looked after. It's really one of the top farms. Between that farm and my farm, there's a government farm. And that farm has gone to pieces, no management, no control. That brings down the value of both our farms. So if I want to sell my farm, I will have no value. And if this bill comes into effect, what is the next step? So I'm getting the impression that the government is at the moment just waiting to seize land that is being used and successful. If they come with a story that says if the land is not utilized, we can still talk about that. But that brings a big fear into our lives. What is going to happen next? Are they going to, like Annette was saying, am I going to can I go on improving my land? Can I expand? Can I think about expansion? Because it's not me and my son and my wife farming on the farm. We are 40 to 45 people, part of a unit. And as I grow, my staff grow, they've got an investment, they can go forward. But now everybody's just jittery about this whole situation.
Yeah. And Peter, the reality is that, you can't, as we were talking, as Thandeka was talking, security of tenure is important for you if you're going to make an investment. To becoming a permanent tenant of the state is not a workable business model for you.
Yeah. Annette has been working with John Mabasa, a situation where he's actually really trying hard to go forward, and he's hamstrung by corruption and all those things. So you were saying that John can't move forward because he's got no ownership. I can't move forward because I might lose my land. So it's a no-win situation. You were saying that there's a basket. The government was saying they've got a basket and a solution for everything, but I think the basket was stolen and there's no solution. I don't see any
government people on the ground giving solutions on the farms. So this is what I want to do. I'm asking, where's government? Where are the experts? Because I'm getting the impression it's all administrative people up there and no farming experienced people. And we farmers next door, we're the ones that can actually give the answers and the help. But I think we're going to get to that point.
I want to actually come to that point, Peter, because I know that one of the things that you do in addition to the farming activities, that you give a lot of support to emerging farmers. I mean, what do you think has been the failure of the state in providing that support to farmers? And what are some of the things that you've been doing to bring up other emerging farmers so that we can really transform the space?
The problem with government at the moment is they are seeing us, for commercial farmers, as enemies. Whereas I think you should, what I always tell the guys that I help, go to the farmer next to you, a successful guy, and listen and learn and run with him. And I think the government is going wrong about distributing land as well. They get a guy, give him land and don't know where he comes from, where he's going. And I think we should have a mentorship. And when I talk about mentorship, is I always say, come to me. I'll teach you for 3 years. I'll give the government feedback. Are you a good farmer? Are you a farmer? Are you a good laborer? Are you a management material or things like that? So government. If I can give you the example, I've got a sheepdog, and if I tell her to go left and she doesn't go, she goes right. What I do is I call her back and redo the whole instruction. So I'm thinking, if government goes on with redistributing land, it's going to make a big mistake. They must stop everything and fix the stuff that they've failed with. The neighbors, the guys that they've just given land, and suddenly, we don't know what to do. We've got no help. Go to a farmer or get the farmers involved. Every farmer in South Africa is passionate about farming, so he will help his neighbor. So let's move on from that point and get farmers involved, because the administrative persons, and if you go look carefully, you'll find that there are basically about one administrative person in the agricultural department for every farm owner. So the balance is absolutely wrong.
And I mean, from my sense, Peter, I mean, you are somebody who wants to share your skills. It's not to say that you want to necessarily just look after your property. You want to share the skills so that you can improve the entire sector.
I've got guys that I mentor that I phone regularly. Every week I'll send them a WhatsApp. This is what I'm doing this week. You should do the same. So we are all passionate about helping. But the problem here is we are creating small little communities where people get land without a purpose. I think we should have the people have a basic plan, and people from government checking up on them regularly. And if they do fail, chuck them out. Because we get more squatters and nobody's got a purpose there. So if you give a person land with, we're not talking about land near towns. We're talking about agricultural land. So what I was saying to you early on, we've got excellent soil, excellent lands here next door. So utilize it. So if John Mabasa, our neighbor, wants to rent it out to a farmer or do something in association with him, let him do it. Rather than let him lie like it is at the moment. Let him, because he doesn't want to do anything, because he said to me the other day, I don't know if I'm there next week. So give him something permanent, but also give him the help and stop seeing the farmers as enemies.
I mean, Thandeka, it's heartbreaking for me that, I mean, there's neglected state land where yet, we are talking about, and we've seen cadres lining their pockets where there are people desperate wanting to get pieces of land like we're talking about.
The mistake that government made in the past was that they were handing out farms initially as if they were handing out amagwinya, without looking at the person to say, is this person passionate about farming? Does this person know what they're talking about? And some cadres were actually romanticizing this farm thing. Oh, we'll go to potch at my farm for the weekend. But that's not good enough, because food security has got to come in. Farming is a serious, risky business. And what we also noticed in my previous life is that people were not trained.
Yeah.
And really, when we talk training, Annette will agree with me. You can take me now and go and train me to be a farmer, but that doesn't make me a farmer.
Yeah, yeah.
You have to go through the whole experience thing, and as Peter says, have a mentor next door to you to actually take you along.
And Peter's talking about the absence of people with actual, experience on the ground. And so you've got these administrators talking about something, but then there's no one to actually take people through the whole process.
No, for sure. I've been saying for a long time, I don't think the Department of Agriculture actually have people in their ranks that understands agriculture.
Yeah.
Agriculture is difficult.
Yeah.
It's a passion. As Tandeka says, you can train someone to do the things, but if you're not passionate about that, I watch the young farmers on Twitter. There's groups of farmers making groups and they're getting together, and they're speaking about weekends and nights and during the rain and during the weather. And if you don't have that passion, you're not going to do it. And I listened to Peter, he spoke about John Mabaso. John Mabaso's family has been on that same land for over 200 years.
Wow.
He was one of the farmers in Mpumalanga who received an eviction letter.
Wow.
Yes. So, and to commit to plant and to work every day of your life with that sword hanging over your head is quite difficult.
And for me, it's a grave injustice. I mean, as you said, somebody who's been on the land for over 200 years. Thembakazi, I want to bring you in here. I mean, the Gwatyu story is one that we have become aware of, and the Gwatyu community has been struggling for years to obtain what rightfully belongs to them. How has this denial of land rights affected the community ya Gwatyu?
Yes, that is true. Gwatyu is a long story of suffering on the land that is owned by the government. So whatever the government means by being a custodian of the land, for us, from our experience, it does not inspire confidence. Because if Gwatyu is an example of how land is going to be managed, under the government, under the ownership of the government, then we have every reason, for us to worry.
Yeah.
So everybody understand what is the meaning of government being a custodian of land. Then I invite you to Gwatyu. Come and see it yourself. And you don't need to go to Zimbabwe, just go here within the country, Gwatyu. Then you will see the level of, destruction that is there under, the ownership of, with land being owned by the government.
Yeah.
We have 100 farms on about 44,000 hectares of land lying fallow. They are not being used actively, not because we don't want to use that land. We want to. All we can do now, we can only do subsistence farming because there is no infrastructure. Even basic infrastructure like water. How can you do farming when you don't even have, water? What kind of farming can you do without water? And, for us, the people of Gwatyu, we have done everything to get the land, transferred to the people. But the government has done, everything they can do to deny us, the security of. So unfortunately for us now, you can't invest in a land that does not belong to you. You can't even raise funds because the land does not belong to you. That's not your land. You don't have security of tenure. And we can't even protect this land from invaders because we don't have ownership.
Yeah. And I mean, Thembakazi, also, I do want to also, I think I asked this question a little bit earlier. I mean, for me, there's a security of tenure and the economics around that and, being able to farm and make a living. But there's also dignity attached to being able to own something. And the denial of not being able to own Indoyo Yako, something that's been in your family for years, is stripping people of that dignity, surely.
Definitely. For Gwatyu, we are just like tenants of government. So sometimes we don't know what is going to happen, what is our future. So it is so frustrating to live, on a land that you don't own.
And tell. I mean, if you could just tell us. I mean, what are some of the people you saying that are some of the things that they want? I mean, if they're saying what have they been saying to government? 3 things that they've been saying they want from government, in addition to, because I mean, you talk about the lack of support, you take the lack of ownership. What are some of the things that you've been saying to government that you need from them?
I think the most important thing is for us to get, the ownership of the land, because there's nothing that we can do on the land without being the owners of that land. We can't use it productively. And in Guaju, we have lived in Guaju for generations. We've been living on that land for years, in fact, for generations. We know how it was used in the past. But unfortunately for now, we can't use, it the way it was used and the way we want to use it.
Yeah. No, and I mean, yes.
Yes, I wanted to say something. We, Annette and I have worked with Tembagazi a lot on the ground in Guaju. And if you go there, your heart breaks.
Yeah.
I don't know what they call it in English. That tree that has thorns all over. It's right through the farm because the people cannot do anything. Tembagazi's dad actually passed away a year or 2 ago after a long struggle of trying to get that land. And then government says we are giving the people. They won't even give them leases. Those 30-year leases that they're talking about. Yeah. We have been to every door. We have walked alongside her trying to get government to give them the land.
Yeah.
But it just does not happen. So you can imagine then, Siviwe, let's say now government wants custody of all property.
Yeah.
If you use Guaju as an example, then what is going to happen?
Exactly. Like Utembagazi says, you don't have to go to Zimbabwe to see the devastation of land dispossession. You just have to go here in the Eastern Cape.
It is right here.
I mean, I want to bring in Untate Ragatse here because Untate Ragatse is an example of somebody who, for years, exactly like Utembagazi is saying, who for years was denied land ownership of his farm. And I want the viewers to hear exactly what it means for him to finally, after 18-year battle, to now what it means for him to own that piece of land. Hello, Untate Ragatse.
Hallo David.
Kan ek nou ingaan?
Asseblief vertel vir ons, hoe voel dit nou dat jy die eienaar is?
Ek voel baie trots omdat ek die eienaar is, omdat ek aan die beplanning goed doen en vir die toekoms mooi beplan vir my en vir my nageslag. Beteken die kinders. Eindelijk, ik kan zeggen, het is het begin van boerderij. Voor al die jaren. Ik heb in vrees geleefd dat boerderij zal niet aan zo lopen. En dat is niet mijn probleem alleen. Nee. Al die boeren, die zwarte boeren in Zuid-Afrika, ze leven in vrees. Eindelijk, ze boeren niet. Ze boeren niet aangezien ze weet die land behoort niet aan ze kan enige tijd uitgeschopt wordt. Of andere optie krijgt van die regering dat je is niet meer gerechtigd om in hierdie grond te blijven. Dan is het baie beter. Ik voel nu, ik heb nu begin met die boerderij. Eindelijk, die regering heeft mij arm gemaakt. Van ik die plaats gekregen heb. Ik heb geboerd met vrees. Daar was niet meer plannen voor die toekomst. Aangezien ik het geweten ik kan die land verlaten.
Ja.
Als je niet die ENR's niet en je niet die papier niet, je hebt niet die kracht om die andere mensen te zeggen, je moet niet in die plaats inkomen. Aangezien je is niet die ENR.
Ja.
Elke ene is die ENR. Je kan komen doen wat je wil doen. Wat zal je maken? Ook met je hoofd. Je zal niet bescherming krijgen. Dat is die probleem waar in ons beland is waarvoor. Als die regering niet kan besluiten om die mensen die ENR-schap te geven aan die boeren, dan dat helpt niks voor die zwarte gemeenschap. Dat wil zeggen, hierdie regering gaan voor ons baie arm maken, voor eeuwig. Ik denk daar moet verbetering wees. Al die zwarte boeren, hulle boer nie, hulle is in die plaats, maar hulle boer nie, hulle skrik. Je weet, als je een mens skrik gemaakt, dan Ek dink nee, ek nie die pad vorentoe nie. Ek loop in die testament. Dis waar ons beland.
Yeah, I mean, that is an amazing story, and I'm so glad, because you also mentioned that the issue around protection from people who invade your land. And when you've got title over it, which is something that Tembagazi was also mentioning a lot earlier.
Yes.
So not only are you able to create an asset, but you're also able to protect yourself. And and I know that Ndata Rahasa also does a lot to help his community now that he is a proud landowner. I'm so glad you're alive to be able to see and be proud of owning your own piece of land, because that's something that many people like Tembagazi's dad were not able to experience.
Ja. Nou, dit is waar, David, ons is almal baie bly dat jy die tyd gekry het om nou die eienaar te wees van jou grond en dat jy ander mense aanmoedig. En ons is bly ook dat Tembagazi is on the show here today so that she can see a person that was successful, and we must just keep on fighting for people like yourselves and Tembagazi and all the other farmers that we are assisting. David, baie dankie.
Baie dankie vir die DNA. Die sal Suid-Afrika red op landbouproces. Baie dankie.
Baie dankie, Ndata Rahasi. I mean, and it's now just to bring this this point across. We had Mr. Ivan Kluter in the Eastern Cape, where people, where government literally was trying to evict him. Again, which what Ndata Rahasi was saying, Tembagazi was saying, this is a massive problem. State-sponsored land grabs.
Yeah, I think the problem is a lot bigger than what we know. I have asked a question earlier the year to the Minister of Agriculture. The state is currently sitting on almost 10 million hectares of land under custodianship of the Department of Agriculture. Currently. That excludes public works and other land that the state owns. That is agricultural land. I have been to the Department of Agriculture. I've asked the question. I've now put in a PIA application to get a list of all the government land under the Department of Agriculture. It's now 8 weeks, 2 months. I haven't received that list. So I don't think the department knows what land they have. I listened to Peter earlier when he said, the neighboring, there's nothing, farming next door. It happens everywhere. And what happens to that land is getting invaded because people see there's nothing happening on the land, so they go and shack there, and then you can't get rid of them. And all the people that we are working with and dealing with on state land is sitting with that exact same problem.
Yeah. And also, this is now becoming also a food security issue. If you've got farms that are being devalued, like Peter said, he can't then... We saw in the recent unrest in KwaZulu-Natal how much food security is the bedrock of our entire country. Even just a consumer like me who walks into my local supermarket, it's deeply affects anybody.
Yeah, I think people in South Africa don't value food security. Because we've never had a food security crisis. But we've seen, as we said, with KZN, once we block the harbours and the farmers can't farm, we're going to have a crisis.
A big problem.
Thandeka, I want to just to touch on the Section 25 process. You have been crisscrossing the country, and you've heard what ordinary people are saying. Besides the rhetoric, let's leave the rhetoric aside. What are ordinary people sort of giving feedback about in this entire process?
Siviwe, I get so emotional when you talk about the public hearings, because all is not as it seems. Government is supposed to go out there and talk to the people and tell them what they want to talk about with them, what they want to consult them on. But when we got there were about 25-30% of the people who actually understood, and I'm talking across the colour line, people who understood what they were talking about, why we must change the Constitution, should we change the Constitution, should we not, etc., etc. But I can tell you now, the majority of people do not know what all of this is all about. They are just told that, do you want
Do you want the land?
Uyafuna umhlaba?
Yes.
Nansi ke le ncwadi encinci.
Yeah.
So everybody says, no, I want land. So let's change this constitution.
Of course. But the reality is that is a lie.
So they tell the people that the constitution is blocking you from getting land. So everybody comes in and they actually say, we want the constitution to be amended.
Yeah.
You know, it actually makes it worse when you see a political party giving people across the country the same script.
Yeah.
Exactly the same thing to say, to show that the people don't have an understanding. And it really breaks my heart, because if people could understand the dynamics behind the land question, they would change their minds.
Yeah.
There is nothing wrong with the constitution. It provides for everything.
Except the ANC has failed you.
But it has failed to actually implement what the constitution says.
It's exactly the process that happens with the NHI hearings across the country. People get given a script to say, do you want to be able to go to Mediclinic in Clifton? Then sign here and say you support this, which is a lie, and which is a complete and utter lie. And so so the scapegoating process of the constitution keeps continuing.
Yes, you know, we had written submissions and we also had the public submissions where we'd go in front of the people. Most of the people with the written submissions said, we don't want the constitution to change. And they gave us very valid arguments on why that should not be.
Yeah.
And there were some people on the ground as well who actually stood up and they talked and they said no. But when it came to committee, it was just all ignored. They looked at the numbers and they said, no, look at this. All these people want the constitution to change. But they don't have the understanding.
Using parliament's processes.
Public participation in the most is a farce, because the people do not understand I nearly said what they're voting for. It's voting season. But what they are actually
being asked to do.
Yeah. And that is the tragedy.
Yeah. Annette Tandega, thank you very much. We'll be back right after this.
The purpose of today's visit was to see how a successful share equity scheme farm is handled, and what we wanted to showcase really is that land reform can work if it is done properly.
We do have a workers' committee on the farm, and in 2008 Mr. Bosman and his 3 sons came to the workers' committee and then informed them that they want to make them part of the whole company.
Dit is so 'n lekker ervaring te weet jy's 'n eienaar, jy's 'n aandeelhouer, jy's 'n vennoot.
To have shares in the business is make me proud. When I started as a general worker, we didn't share in the vision of the farm. We come and we do the daily work, but now we understand what we must do, why we do it.
We want to uplift our people and empower them so that they can feel what it is to be a shareholder.
We are shareholders in the business. Our lifestyle is improving. We know for sure now we have a better future for our children.
Dit gaan oor die verhoudinge wat gebou is oor die jare. Dit gaan oor my familie en jou familie, maar ons werk almal saam. Ons praat dit een mond in. Dit is wat 'n plaas maak. Dit is wat 'n gemeenskap maak. Want almal staan saam, almal kyk na mekaar.
If constitutional property rights are diluted, if the assumptions on which businesses and investors have been operating in this country for the past 26 years are suddenly changed, what will be the impact on the South African economy? More than a decade of low economic growth, a 40% unemployment rate, small businesses devastated by lockdowns and the delayed vaccine rollout. This is the condition of the economy, even before we factor in the threat to private property rights. Surely the government's focus should be on the reforms that will make South Africa an attractive destination for jobs and investment, especially jobs for young people. Instead, the ANC has dragged the country into an argument about how much power an already incapable state should have over the economy. To understand the economic impact of this debate, we're joined in studio by Dr. Annelie Lottrie, chairperson of the DA Parliamentary Caucus, and DA MP Dr. Mimi Gondwe. We're also joined on Zoom by Professor William Gumede from the University of the Witwatersrand. Professor Gumede, I want to start with you. Welcome to this summit and for being part of it. Thanks very much. You've been fairly consistent in saying that tampering with Section 25 is a bad idea. In fact, you wrote a piece that was entitled Tampering with Property Rights Breaks Countries. Explain to us why that is.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'll be very quick, and I'll just tell you, I mean, really, I've looked at 3 African countries who have done land reform without compensation: Algeria, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe after the Second World War. 50 years down the line, the economies crashed, the currencies plummeted, food production collapsed in all of these 3 countries. Tanzania, what they did, the state took over expropriated land. In Zimbabwe, what happened, land went to black peasants, ZANU-PF party leaders, and former war veterans. Now, what happened, I mean, just very, very quickly, in Algeria, it deindustrialized. It lost all its capacity to manufacture and to produce what it did before land reform. I mean, the Algerian economy was stuck in a prolonged recession between 1987 and 1995. I mean, employment between 1985 and 1991 grew 190%. I mean, between 1988 and 1991, Algeria's nominal exchange rate, that's the amount of currency needed to pursue foreign currency, depreciated 60%. Right now, Algeria is Africa's largest importer of agricultural goods. Now, before land reform, Algeria was one of those countries that actually exported agricultural project. Tanzania, again, I mean, in the 1970s, was one of the worst experienced one of the worst economic breakdowns seen in a country not involved in a war or experiencing a major disaster. I mean, only Zimbabwe's economic collapse in the 1990s would eclipse what happened in Tanzania after the land reform. I mean, just examples, I mean, inflation in Tanzania went up 30%, exchange rate depreciated by more than 60%, unemployment tripled, and the country became a net food importer. Right now in Tanzania, 90% of the country's yearly budget for agriculture is spent on food imports. I mean, lastly, just in terms of Zimbabwean land reform, what happened is in 1998, we saw inflation peaking. This is now after the land reform, from 48%, of course, already to reaching 79.6%. Let me repeat it: 79.6 billion %. That is inflation between 2008 and 2009. I mean, this is the biggest inflation the world has ever seen. It's never, ever seen such inflation. Unemployment is where after that land reform went on to 60%. And that's, I tell you, is very, very conservative estimation. Around now, I mean, now 40% of Zimbabwean households are hungry and need regular food aid. They get packaged food. And I must tell you a quote. I mean, I'll end it off here with a quote. In 2015, The then Robert Mugabe, he was at a meeting of the ZANU-PF's Women's League, and he asked the question at a meeting, but what is it that the people are suffering from? Didn't we give them land? And that wasn't a response when people were telling him that Zimbabweans are dying of hunger. He said, well, we gave them land. Why are they crying?
Thanks, Professor Gumede. So obviously, I mean, 3 disaster cases where tampering with property rights has led not only to shrinking economy, but to famine and to those countries becoming beggars to others to provide for their needs. But very often it seems that the debate is about either nothing happens or we tamper with property rights. Is there somewhere where you can, is there an example of where you can not tamper with property rights and achieve effective land reform?
No, absolutely. No, let me just maybe just a quick explanation why tampering with property rights is the problem. I mean, you know, just in simple terms. And I mean, I could, you know, afterwards, I can send my own report, you know, to members or those who want it. I think just the first thing about, you know, land reform is complicated. Yeah. So what it did, you demand complex coordination, and you also need to manage market perceptions. Now, the very first thing you need is a competent public sector to manage it. Now, in Algeria, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe, at the time of their land reform, the public services were totally incompetent, staffed by party cronies. Corruption was out of control already there, and the countries had mismanaged the economy. So they already started off, you know, on that kind of basis. The second thing about land reform, which makes it so difficult, is that, you know what it does if you do it without compensation? It undermines the confidence in the property system. But not only the property system, but also the financial system that underpins the economy, and it also undermines market confidence. Now, a key thing is it breaks the system of seeking credit based on one asset. So it's not only that one now lose, the confidence in the land, but lose confidence in all other assets, whether it's property, businesses, mines, everything. So it's a collapse of confidence in the economic system because of the destruction of the right to property. So it goes across it now. And then immediately what happens once you've got that loss of confidence, you see foreign and local investors move their money out of the country, mass capital investment and skills flight because people are scared, food security collapse almost immediately, agricultural productivity prices in the markets collapse. Immediately you get a sources of basic food, starvation and unemployment, because then what also happens is that your currency collapse, inflation spiral. I mean, we saw the Zimbabwean inflation into billions. Other businesses collapse. It just means in sort of economy collapse overnight. And often, as we've seen in Tanzania, Algeria, takes about 50 years before one see.
50 years. So it puts us back 50 years if that scenario plays out. Jordan, I wanted to ask you about the importance of agricultural jobs productivity, but given the broad overview given by Professor Gumede, it's clear that tampering with property rights is not just about farms and food and the agricultural sector. It literally shakes all of the assumptions on which a modern industrial economy is built.
I think that was the really powerful point that you've just made, Professor, that stuck out to me. I mean, in South Africa alone, Celia, there are between 700,000 and 800,000 agri-employees, agri-workers in South Africa. So it's an enormous part of the economy. Even though it makes a very small contribution to GDP, around 1%, it's very labor-intensive. So it provides more than 6% of total employment. Huge number of jobs, and families supported through those jobs. But I think the professor's profound point is that it's not only those 800,000 jobs that are at risk. When you start tampering with the foundations of property rights in an economy, you know, the economy is like a beautiful, intricate tapestry. And the backing board behind that tapestry and the frame around it is property rights. And when you start pulling at that, the whole thing starts to unravel. And so the fascinating point is that you might ask yourself, well, why did it affect heavy manufacturing and industry in Algeria when you start messing with property rights? But that is the perfect case study for why you cannot mess with that beautiful tapestry.
And what struck me, Jordan, is the figure of 50 years. It sets you back 50 years. Now, we've had, in some instances, a lot of success in the past 25 years of democracy. We've built a lot as a free country. But there's also been a lot of wasted years, lots of wasted opportunities. And this idea that tamper with private property rights now, and you're stuck in a position of no opportunities, low growth for 50 years, a sin bin, effectively, in the global economy. That really speaks to me as a risk of tampering with property rights.
Yes, and I think that's related to this economic concept of fallout risk that the professor hasn't mentioned specifically, but I have no doubt that's what he was referring to. And that is this enormous signal effect, this bright red flashing light that goes to the whole world that says, here is an economy that is essentially committing self-harm by tampering with property rights. Stay far away. And that undermines so much else in the economy, and as you say, it puts us in the sin bin for years and years and years that it takes to recover even if you correct the mistake that you've made, to recover the confidence and the sense of security for investors takes absolutely years, if not decades, as we've heard.
Annelie, you are a member of this Section 25 committee that's looking at the ANC proposal that's, we've heard, changed a few times. There's been a few iterations. Now, you have written to the presidency to ask for a socio-economic impact study. Now, that is an assessment of what this law, the change to the Constitution, what economic impact it will have. What do you expect such an assessment to say? And what has been the response from the presidency, given the likely impact?
Well, this is exactly the issues that Professor Gumede raised, is that we cannot vote on legislation if we don't know what this impact is. And we've just heard the devastating impact this can have. Now, the unit in the presidency was established precisely for that reason, to do this kind of impact assessment so that we make sure that no policy or piece of legislation has this negative effect in the long term on the economy or on the country as a whole. Now, up to now, what the answer I have received, which is shocking, very concerning, is that this whole matter will be left to when it is implemented. So we are
What's the use of having an assessment after the fact?
So we are going into this blind. We've heard earlier about the impact on the banking sector, on mortgages, land being used, property being used for collateral. It is trillions that we are talking about. And as Jordan says, this is like a domino. It's a knock-on effect. So we can't go into this piece of legislation to amend the Constitution without any impact study done on what the economic effects will be.
Yeah. Jordan, you are the DA's finance guy, and you look at budgets, and very often budgets give you an indication of priorities. What a government budgets for shows what it cares about, what it wants to achieve. So if we look at the broader issue of land and land reform, how much of a priority has land reform been for government, for the ANC, if we look at the budgets?
So just to give you some numbers, they sound like big numbers, but let me put them in context. You know, the ANC budgets less than 7 billion rand for land reform. To give you an idea, that is less than 0.5% of our entire national. It's less than the ANC spends on blue light brigades and bodyguards for VIP politicians all over the country. They have demonstrated time and time again, and sorry, that amount has been declining over the years. Ever since about 2010, that number's actually been slowly declining. They have demonstrated absolutely clearly that they do not care at all about implementing a steady, comprehensive, competent land reform process that takes time but delivers results in the end. as, again, the point the professor's made about the state capacity. And it's clear from the beginning that they've attempted to use this process as a scapegoat for that failure. And that is absolutely clear as day for anyone reading the budget.
So, I mean, if you're not going to budget properly for land reform, but now you want to change the constitution, it just sort of exposes that this is not a genuine process.
Not at all. Annette Steyn, who was just on the previous panel, has often made the point that if the government was serious about land reform, you could go and purchase a vast amount of land on the open market if you had the necessary financial resources or were prepared to commit the necessary financial resources to do so. The fact that you even have to talk about wanting to expropriate 25 years after not giving adequate attention and resources to this problem really tells you everything that you need to know.
Absolutely.
Celia, but could I perhaps just say, Jordan, but that's where the nil compensation comes in, because that's the easy way out. So it's supposed to be the absolute exception, as Dr. Jeffrey said earlier, but now it will be the go-to.
Yeah, we're writing constitutions for exceptions. Yes. Professor Gumede, I want to bring you in here. You know, we are politicians and you're an analyst, and you know, you can stand back from the politics. You have written in a different context about the ANC, about the political dynamics within the ANC. If we look at South Africa's economic situation, unemployment, expanded unemployment more than 40%, 42%, the pressure that the economy is under, the indications from experts like you that the tampering with property rights might have disastrous consequences that none of us can fully comprehend. Why do you think the ANC is then still intent on pushing through with expropriation without compensation and tampering with Section 25?
I think most probably there's a poor understanding of property rights. I mean, I think, and I guess across society, there is a very poor understanding. And people think about property rights, I think, in a very limited way. But, you know, where we are in the modern economy, property rights go far beyond just the land we are talking about. I mean, when I said earlier, and, you know, if you own a mine, you know, it's the same. You're going to have security you have to know that assets are secure before you make the investment. And so on. And I think that is a misunderstood. And then the second thing, you know, the thing about land, of course, there's an emotional thing about it. There's existential, I mean, to use their word, because, you know, with the act of colonialism, the very first thing was the taking of land. So it becomes emotional. And understandably, so it's almost like catastrophic that people would argue that, look, you know, if one changes, take the land forcefully without expropriation, that will now clear and it will be a remedy of the past. But of course, you know, in the real world, that is not the case. In fact, that will just harm you even more. We have to be pragmatic. We have to be practical. And sadly also, because of this emotional issue linked to land reform, it is easily used as, you know, from a populistic point of view. When you run out of votes, I mean, just think about Zimbabwe. I mean, the moment that happened, that is, you know, it's a return almost to that sort of easy populistic type of thing to try to garner votes. So unfortunately, that is why land reform will have to be done in a very honest way, in a very practical way, but I think in a forward-looking way, rather than the thing about countries really, and the thing about development, is that one cannot base the future on the past. It's like in one's individual life. Yes, I'm not saying one must forget the past and one must, you know, just play over the past, but one has to build for the future and build it in the present. And it is very, very important. And unfortunately, many liberation leaders and movements don't get to that kind of maturity because it means a mature politics, a politics of the present and a politics of the future.
And I want to unpack some of those issues more. But Jordan, Professor Gumede mentioned the mining sector right there. And our summit spoke about the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Act, which introduced this concept of custodianship for the first time. And effectively in South Africa, we have a nationalized mineral rights system.
Yes.
It was snuck up on us in the 2000s. Is that a warning? Is the decline of the mining sector in this country, and we know thousands of jobs being lost in a country that's mineral rich, is that decline a proper warning for us about property rights in general?
The example could not be more perfect and more tragic in a sense. One of the most mineral-rich nations on the face of the planet, the biggest gold and platinum metals group deposits anywhere, and there has not been a single meaningful investment in South Africa's mining sector. I'm going to say in a decade. I might be out by a year or two either way, but for the better part of a decade, not a single meaningful investment in South Africa's mining sector. And when you just ask the mining industry what the problem is, it's not that there's a lack of opportunity. Opportunity is plentiful. It's that there is such an unfriendly regulatory and legislative environment to investment, so much insecurity around mining rights and security of title to those rights, that it just doesn't make sense to risk all of that to invest. Think of the capital expenditure required to invest in building a new mine or sinking a new shaft. It just doesn't make sense when there are other, perhaps less glittering deposits elsewhere in the world, but much more secure. So the example is perfect.
And the problem is not just lack of investment, it's companies actively disinvesting and running away.
Indeed, we've had some of South Africa's oldest, most established mining companies which are no longer present in this country. And that kind of happens as a one-day story in the newspaper, but that story means tens of thousands of people who would otherwise have been employed, now unemployed. It's a tragedy, actually.
Mimi, we've spoken about examples in the rest of Africa where government has tampered with property rights and it's had disastrous consequences. What would you say to the argument, no, but South Africa is exceptional? We don't run that risk. We're not Zimbabwe. We're not Algeria. What would you say to folks who aren't really worried because they do have a sense of South African exceptionalism?
I would definitely say we need to be worried. Celius, just from tinkering with this idea of expropriation without compensation, our foreign direct investment has taken a slight dip, and you look at, and let me just add to what Professor Gumede has said around Zimbabwe. As we're sitting here, the majority of Zimbabweans are in diaspora. People have fled the country and they've gone into neighboring countries. Zimbabwe has no currency. It's collapsed. And with the collapse of the currency, people's savings, pensions also just disappeared overnight. You've got shortages around food, and we already have a problem of food security in Africa because of climate change and other factors. Shortages of food, basic commodities such as your cooking oil and your sugar, are not there. And even if they are there, they are sold at an arm and a leg. Zimbabwe had a booming agricultural sector at some point and was considered the breadbasket of Africa. Now, it's no longer the case. It also had a thriving tourism sector at some point with tourist attractions such as Great Zimbabwe and Victoria Falls. That has all fallen away. I'm just trying to show you the impact. You've got these shortages, and you have people bearing the brunt of that decision to expropriate land, without compensation. And I stand to be corrected, but I read that, the whole decision cost the country around $20 billion. If you use yesterday's exchange rate, the dollar to the rand, rate, which was 14.87 yesterday, that works out to nearly 300 million.
And now even with
300 billion rands,
yes.
And then So, Celia's and the aftermath of this decision also was that courts were bogged down with cases, relating to this issue of expropriation without compensation. And then, Celia's, we also have another country that we can look to, and that's Venezuela, where millions of hectares of land, were seized and put into the hands of cronies and political allies of the ruling faction. And Venezuela is also experiencing shortages, electricity shortages in medicine, food shortages. The UN Commissioner for Refugees estimates that 15% of the population has fled the country, and unemployment is estimated at 90%.
And those countries become exporters of people,
Exactly.
exporters of talented people,
And
people who are lost to the country and to creating opportunities.
Someone will have to pay the price for this decision, and it's usually the ordinary person on the street. And
You can't leave.
Exactly.
You can't leave.
And I must add that I think women will end up paying the a dearer price than most people, because most cases they're the ones that bear the burden of poverty, unemployment, inequality, even disease, And Celia's, I think we're going to end up paying a bigger price than we did for this pandemic and for this recent insurrection in KZN and Durban, just from this decision to expropriate land without compensation and have, land under
to get
state.
stuck into this argument
Exactly.
and waste so much time. Professor Gumede, do you think that South Africa can look to Zimbabwe and Venezuela and Algeria, and the other example that you mentioned, and apply it to our circumstances? What would you say to someone who says to you, well, no, South Africa is just not Zimbabwe, the risk doesn't arise?
You know what? There's no happy ending if we're going to go to Zimbabwe. And of course, for those who make an argument that we're the exception, we've shown we're not the exception. Yeah, so, we have to be brutally honest with ourselves. We're not the exception. But there are, wonderful other models there of land reform. Number one. And secondly, also, if we look at this in a very practical way, we can manage it because now we also have the crisis, the financial crisis of COVID-19 and then the looting. This really is a perfect storm. Adding expropriation without compensation, it's a perfect storm of destruction. And as I say, if you look at the countries, it will take, for us, half a century. That is what, sadly, the cold facts show us. The 3 countries in Africa that's gone this way. Why do we want to repeat what the Zimbabweans have done? Why do we want to repeat what the Algerians have done? Why do we want to repeat what has happened in Tanzania? I think maybe we have to look at the Japanese if we really want to go look for other examples, although I think we could actually, there's much more practical ways here at home that we can work around it. But Japan has had the most successful land reform that the world has ever seen. It has been, that land reform has been the basis really of their economic takeoff after the Second World War. You just remember where they were totally destroyed after the Second World War. And a big part of that was, the compensation, they had a compensation to it. And some parts you have to think about their fiscus, immediately after 1945, they didn't have the kind of money. But what they did, it was a very practical approach where they say, look, you know what we'll do is the land, viable commercial land won't be reformed. Won't be
targeted.
And so on. And that's a very core thing. And that's the first thing we need to do in South Africa. We have to say, if there is commercial farming that is viable, we don't touch it. We absolutely don't touch it. Yeah, I think that's the very first thing. The second thing what we will have to do is, when we focus on Black people who are already farming, people with a skin in the game, and there's about over 5 million of them, support them. So, we exclude anyone else who's not in the farming business. If you're Black and you're not in the farming business, sorry. Because, farming is labor intensive and it's hard intensive. and it's commercially intensive. So we're going to have to start with those already there, wakes up at 3 o'clock in the morning, they there. Give them access to finance, give them mentoring opportunities, give them expert advice. Then what we need to do, and I think this for me is mostly even more important, specific in an African context, is to communal land. Just think about KwaZulu-Natal. 75% of the land in KwaZulu-Natal is owned, under the auspices of the royal house. 75% of all the land in KwaZulu-Natal. Now, the obvious thing is to hand over that land to individuals as title deeds. You just imagine the difference economically. If we do it tomorrow, what it does. Think about Limpopo, the Eastern Cape, and Northwest, and so on. So because this is also, again, from other African countries, they haven't done that. They haven't transferred land to individuals. So once we've got that, we really will open up this economy. And we'll give people a fighting chance. We secure property rights, we expand it from the communal land, we keep the commercial farms going. And of course, those who are willing to want to leave, we open that up, we pay them the money to do that. But then what we do is where we do the transformation is downstream. We say, how do we build agribusinesses and how do we empower people there? How do we build a skills base from technical education to all the sort of artisans and so on in the agricultural value chain? So those are the things that we would talk about. Some farmers who want to create social packs, giving shareholders to some of the, farm workers and so on. So, a real combination of different things, creative, imaginative, but at the heart of it all must be property rights must be there and compensation must be there.
So, Jordan, land reform is always going to be a complicated task. It's always going to be difficult, but there is no solution that starts with writing off private property rights.
Quite the opposite. We do have a history of forced dispossession of private property rights in this country, and that must be put right. But it boggles the mind to think that you can put that right by perpetuating forced dispossession of private property rights. Well, you have to restore private property rights and bolster them, strengthen them, and give people full beneficial ownership title to the land that they live and work on. And that would be, I think, unlock something of an economic miracle in our country. So yes, it is a problem that needs attention, but absolutely not by means of undermining the thing that is at the heart of the problem in any case.
Absolutely. Anli, I want to give you the last word. All of these arguments, you think your colleagues on that Section 25 committee will be persuaded, given the weight of the evidence, just to drop this and quietly let it go?
These are the arguments we have been making, but it falls on deaf ears. So unfortunately, this is a political effort. It is nothing to do with the country, the welfare of the citizens of this country, the economy of this country. This is for political gain and expediency.
Well, there you have it. Some very concrete, positive policy proposals that does not involve diluting constitutional property rights, tampering with the Bill of Rights. That is what we set out to achieve and put together at this Land Summit. Please stay tuned. We'll be back right after this.
Landbou is 'n integrale deel van Suid-Afrika. Dis een van die belangrikste sektore in ons ekonomie. Ons het dit nou gesien tydens die pandemie en die Grendelstaat. Landbou was die een sektor wat uitstekend gevaar het. Maar die hartseer en tragiese realiteit is dat ons landbouers, ons landelike gemeenskappe onder druk verkeer. Aan die een kant word boere, plaaswerkers, plaaslike gemeenskappe aangeval, gemartel, vermoor. En aan die ander kant het ons nou deurlopende praatjies en druk van die regering se kant af dat grond sonder vergoeding onteien moet word. Nou, as grond sonder vergoeding onteien word, beteken dit dat ons landbousekerheid en voedselsekerheid in gedrang gaan bring. Dit is nie in belang van Suid-Afrika nie. En ek kan vir u verseker dat die DA alles in hulle vermoë sal doen om te verseker dat ons landelike gemeenskappe, ons boere, ons plaaswerkers veilig is. En dat ons ook alles sal doen om te keer dat daar onteiening sonder vergoeding sal plaasvind. Ons sê dit is ongrondwetlik en ons sal tot in die hoogste hof beklei om te verseker dat 'n boer en 'n landbouer se grond beveilig word en dat hulle eiendomsreg verseker word.
South Africa's constitution has been hailed around the world as one of the most progressive of its kind. For over 2 decades, our constitution has guided lawmaking, judgments, and legal precedent around the country. The question around land reform and redistribution of land has brought to the front a possible amendment of the constitution. Section 25 of the constitution makes provision for land reform and redistribution. Except the ANC has failed to use this provision to undo the legacy of the 1913 Land Act. They have failed to deliver on the promise of redressing the injustices of the past and instead opted to scapegoat the Constitution. Today we ask the question, has the Constitution been a hindrance to addressing inequality, and does it need to change? Or are the ANC threatening the integrity of the Bill of Rights to mask their own failings? Our guests for this section are here to answer this question. I'm joined in studio by Werner Horn, attorney and member of parliament, and Malusi Boy, the MMC of Human Settlements, Dr. Annelie Lotriet, the chairperson of the DA Parliamentary Caucus. And on Zoom, I'm joined by John Steenhuisen, the leader of the Democratic Alliance, and Gwen Gwenya, the DA's head of policy. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to start off with you, and really would like to give you an opportunity to say, look, we've had a lot of conversation during this summit, talking about why amending the Constitution is an incredibly bad idea. But what is the DA's proposal in this regard? What is it that we're putting on the table on how we can really mend the skewed land ownership patterns as we're seeing in the country?
So thanks very much, Sib. And let me just say that it's been so great to watch this particular land summit. And thank you very much to the guests and panelists, as well as to both yourself and Saliha, who've done an excellent job here. I think that the starting point said the DA is completely committed to land reform. We view it as both a moral and an economic imperative in South Africa. And it's first and foremost has to be about trying to achieve some form of justice for the evils of race-based legislation that planned and dispossessed and deprived and upended and destroyed the lives of many, many black South Africans during apartheid and colonialism. But it also makes economic sense to tackle the gross inequality of opportunity that locks millions of people out of our active economy, entrenches poverty as well as inequality. And the current skewed patterns can never be acceptable to us. The challenges are complex, but I think, as is starting to emerge from the summit today, are not insurmountable, and meaningful land reform can and must happen. We've got to stop the scapegoating of the Constitution, and we need to fix the basics. Let's be very, very clear that property rights are a cornerstone of the economy and any liberal democracy. If farmers don't own the land, they cannot use it as collateral to take the loans to improve the productivity of the land. And even if they do own the land, lenders, as we've heard, are going to be incredibly reluctant to lend, knowing the prospects of that. So what we need to do is to not replicate failure. And we need to sow instead the seeds of success in the land reform space here. and private property rights and full ownership for emerging farmers, a larger budget for land reform. We've heard from Jordan just how little money is put where the mouth is when it comes to the ANC's issues on the budgeting. Political will, public appointments on merit, and better land reform legislation, as well as respect for the Constitution and the rule of law, are going to be fundamental linchpins to keep together the proposals that we have to ensure meaningful land reform. And those are really the seeds that we've got to plant if we're going to harvest a more abundant life for South Africans. So we need to stop looking at the scapegoats, the Constitution, willing seller, willing buyer myth that has been created. If we are serious about land reform, particularly in rural land reform, we need to be serious about giving emerging farmers what they need to succeed in making that land productive. They need to own the land they farm, first of all. They need to have security of tenure so that they can leverage that property and get the maximum benefit out of it. And they need assistance with startup capital and support, as well as a transfer of technical know-how. And if we are committed to broad-based land reform, we also need to accept that the reality that South Africa is fast urbanizing. And what most people want, contrary to the myth, is that most people want to own land in urban areas close to economic opportunity. And that is why we focus on giving out title deeds as fast as we can and why we push for them. So we've got to defend property rights, but then we've also got to rapidly accelerate the output that we have of putting land in the hands of ordinary South Africans, so that we take out this political leverage that the EFF and the ANC like to use, and we actually start focusing on how important it is to have a land-owning class in South Africa, and that when people own land, they have a stake in the economy, they've got a productive asset, and they've got something which to leave as a legacy.
And of course, John, one of the big things here is that, as it was discussed in the previous segment, is that in the Democratic Alliance where we govern, we have essentially demonstrated how you can actually roll out a successful land reform project or a program.
Absolutely. And if you read the high-level panel report that Kgalema Motlanthe produced, again, not a DA man, ANC man, produced the high-level panel report. He said that one of the biggest impediments to land reform was the rent seeking that had entered into the process. And I think what the DA has been able to demonstrate is that when you remove the rent seeking from it, where you don't have a Freda Dairy type where it was trying to be sent to the Guptas, or you don't have the Kluti case that you had, you don't have the messing around that we've seen with so many land reform farms that have gone to benefit people who should never have qualified for them. You remove the rent seeking and support that the Western Cape Agricultural Department has done. That really is the game changer, and that you can have meaningful land reform in South Africa. You just can't have it with the ANC's rent-seeking entrenched policies of cadre deployment, of ensuring that there's a small group of people who benefit. Just like those people who try to give Mr. Kluti's farm to a very well-connected ANC individual rather than actually genuine beneficiaries.
Absolutely. And before I come to Gwena, Malusi, I want to come to you because I think John mentioned a really important point about the fact that South Africa is fast urbanizing, and a lot of people want to be able to own title. They want to be able to be homeowners in economic hubs. And so that becomes a very important part of some of the work that you do. And so what has been some of the things that you've been doing as the MMC to make sure that we restore dignity in that way?
Well, thank you, Svea. And I think what John is saying is very important. And also as a city, we have experienced this migration of people coming from rural areas to urban areas. But also it's people who are coming outside the country. And countries that the professor earlier was mentioning, like Zimbabwe, Tanzania. And this has put a lot of burden on the country, on the housing delivery, because as the country, we are unable to even give those individuals houses because our own regulations don't permit that. What then happens? What you then see, you'd see people going to invade land and all sorts. If for an example, yesterday I was in Imizamoyet, majority of people who are staying in Imizamoyet are foreign nationals. Now we're unable to give those individuals title deeds, but our own South Africans who are rolling out title deeds, I mean, out of the 190,000 people that have benefited from our housing program as a DA government, to date we have delivered more than 149,000 of those. We have given them title deeds. Now they are homeowners. They take pride to their houses. We have restored dignity to them. We have made sure that from now on they can be able to salvage and make sure that, as John was indicating, make something out of those properties that we have invested jointly with them.
And of course, Malusi, what then becomes important is that people can then use that to leverage that asset economically, and they can be able to be economic actors in the country.
Precisely, and we encourage them, and we also, when we hand over those title deeds, of which it's a program that as a city and as a MECO member for human settlements, to make sure that we encourage and educate them. We have a program to make sure that they keep those houses, they keep those title deeds safe, because this is the certification of them that they are landowners, and they take pride and dignity, and you'll see smiles on them. And as a DA government, we are very proud to be delivering those title deeds and restoring their dignity.
Absolutely. And Gwen, I want to bring you in here. From a policy perspective, I think it's quite important if you can perhaps just illustrate to us what are the key differences between what the ANC and the EFF are proposing on the one side and what the DA is proposing from a policy point of view on how we can really undo the skewed land ownership issue in the country, but at the same time making sure that we redress the injustices of the past, but also without really depriving people of private property rights.
Sure, well, that's a big question, but I do like the turn that the conversation has taken at this part of the Land Summit on urban land, because if there's anything that I would want to stress from a policy perspective is that the demand for land is actually largely an urban issue. Over 2/3 of South Africans live in urban areas and rising, and that's also evidenced by where land occupations and informal developments are taking place. So we have to absolutely place urban land reform at the fore. And so if we look at then what the demand for urban land, well-located land is about and why we haven't succeeded, you can essentially break it down into the supply side issues that are inherent in the challenges in urban land reform and the demand side challenges. So on the supply side, it's obviously partly a failure of the democratic government to address the apartheid spatial urban design, which has resulted in these low-density, sprawling urban centres. And in South Africa, we haven't been able to adequately leverage the benefits that come from compact smart cities. So part of the challenge is to ensure that we have urban densification strategies that are implemented obviously in a sustainable way, but we do need to densify some urban areas. Secondly, we also need the release of well-located state-owned land. So constantly there's this conversation about land audits, etc. And I mean, I was looking at a DP 1998 document that talked about the release of state-owned land. So this is hardly a new policy area or proposal, but the point is over 2 decades later, here we are still banging on the same issue. But there needs to be in every city, every province at a national level, a clear idea of where the land, where state-owned land parcels are located, their size and the current use to which they are currently being put, in order to make sure that land is being utilised for its highest and best use. But then, so that's on the supply side, and then also looking at making sure that on the demand side, that we deal with why demand is so low. Now, this statement might come as a surprise to some people, because often the argument is that there's high levels of demand for urban land, and supply can't catch up. That's a false assessment. There are very low levels of effective demand. What people talk about when they say there are high levels of demand, they mean that there are many people who want houses or land in urban areas. But that's the wrong concept of demand to look at. The correct concept is effective demand. It's not only how many people want urban housing or land, but how many people want and are willing and able to pay for urban housing. And there are very few people who are able to afford urban housing, and that's where issues like unemployment, jobs, people being low skilled and low wages come in, because ideally we want to create a population that can afford to pay for their own land, their own housing. Of course, the bulk of the discussion today has been about the state enabling the release of land, etc. But ideally, actually, you want to get to a stage where people have the economic independence to be able to purchase housing, to be able to purchase land. So there are those supply side issues and the demand side issues to why well-located urban land has not been released.
Yeah. And Annelie, I want to bring you in here because Gwen raises some important points about, the big assumptions that are being made about what the public views, or at least what the public wants. And this is a big part of the parliamentary process, right? And that's why part of lawmaking requires parliamentarians to go out and seek public opinion. And so, but this process has been fraught thus far around getting public views on the parliamentary process.
Absolutely, Sibiwe. We've gone through two processes because remember it started in 2018 already with the first process to decide whether there is need for an amendment of Section 25. And we had public hearings, and I think Thandeka said a bit earlier, the problem is people come with scripted replies. So if we look at the written submissions of what people have actually said, and also some of the oral submissions during the hearings, it is not clear-cut in terms of everyone wants a farm or urban land, as we've just said, or would they rather prefer money instead of a piece of land? So it's not clear-cut, but the main problem, Siviwe, what we've experienced is that these public opinions really mean nothing in the end because there's a predetermined idea of what's going to happen, and we go through the motions and it's ticking the boxes.
Yeah. And Malusi, I know that the City of Cape Town often, particularly when it comes to seeking spaces to build urban and affordable, low-cost housing for people, that there's often a big tussle with national government. So here you have a situation where there's already a predetermined outcome of what the public must and say they want, but at the same time, there's almost unwillingness from national government to release pieces of land to cities so that they may be able to develop them for low-cost housing for people.
The irony about it is that some of members who are national government and part of cabinet today, they've been seeking, when they were on the DA side, seeking these land parcels from the very same department, which is Public Works to date. And when I assumed my responsibility as a MECO member in the city, I made the same call because of the challenges that we're confronted with, so that we can enable people to have their own homes, their site and service for those who earn more than that 3,500 threshold. And we have not received a response. And it's this to and fro, and there are huge land parcels. And I think one of the panelists there was mentioning that there are thousands of square kilometers of land that we can be able to dispose to many South Africans, and also within the City of Cape Town, we can make sure that our citizens, we enable them to get those land parcels so that they can be able to develop themselves further. And national government is depriving many citizens of that opportunity. But we'll keep pushing because we are representing people on the ground, and we know the need that is out there. And we are working tirelessly to make sure that at the end of the day, citizens win in this particular instance.
And Werner, that's where actually where I want to bring you in as well. Exactly what Malusi is saying, that in spite of the challenges, we're going to keep pushing, we're going to keep fighting. So a lot of people, I know, members of the media have also asked on the panel, on the chat function, if then this unholy alliance between the EFF and the ANC proceeds, what legal recourse is available? Is there room, are there grounds for us to challenge this? What can we do? Because we've now got unrefuted evidence about how bad an idea it is to amend the Constitution for this function.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I think it's important that everybody out there must realize that this is neither the beginning or the end. If this proposal is ultimately passed, as you say, if this unholy alliance between the EFF and the ANC ultimately comes together. What we must understand in terms of ultimately scrutinizing the legality of such an amendment is it can be done on two grounds. Firstly, procedural irregularities. Now, Annelie touched on the fact that there was really no meaningful public participation, and our court has held, the Constitutional Court, as far back as in the Doctors for Life case in 2006, that ultimately meaningful participation in respect of legislative amendments is a pre-requirement for it to be valid. In that case, the court looked at three criteria, and if I state them, everybody would just easily realize how important meaningful public participation in the current circumstances really would have been or are. And that is the nature of the legislation, the importance of the legislation, and the intensity of the impact on the public as a consequence of passing the legislation. Now, that speaks for itself. So, yes, and then interestingly enough, if one for a moment focuses on the latest version of this bill, which has been also put on the table today, that it looks in dramatic ways very much different to the one that it was the product of the original resolution of Parliament. In the Merafong case in 2008, the court said that, but if you ultimately want to change your mind after having consulted, you have a duty to go back to the same public in the same way and again consult on your latest proposal. So that's in terms of procedural irregularities. Of course, there's also the option of attacking any amendment on the basis of the merit or the constitutionality of the amendment itself. Now, that is, of course, also an interesting debate that should unfold at this stage, I think, in our country. Parliamentary Legal Services has gone through some process of briefing the committee and assuring the committee that the basic structure, as it is called, of our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, to which you referred earlier, is not under threat by this amendment. But that's easier said than done. If one looks at the preamble and the foundational aspects contained in our Constitution, there's a good case to be made out that tinkering with Section 25 to the point where the basic substance of it is changed have an impact on the whole constitutional coherence of the Bill of Rights. And obviously, if this unholy alliance of the ANC and the EFF come together and pass this, that's also grounds on which we and hopefully also civil society out there will join and take this matter to the highest court for it ultimately to decide. Thanks.
Yeah, and I mean, and Vanna raised an important point, Annelie, here, and that we often speak about, which is the role of Parliament in terms of being able to, almost as like a misunderstanding of what Parliament is meant to do and how it meant to represent the very people who elected us to office. So now, if you are essentially stinging the public of a public participation process, Parliament is yet again failing the people of South Africa as the institution.
Absolutely. And it is a massive failure of the people of South Africa. If we are looking at just written submissions, the first round we had more than 700,000. Sure. In the end, they used 400. They looked at 400. The second round, there's more than 200,000. So you can see how this is really a farce, that they're going through the motions. But as Werner quite correctly says, in the Merafong case, you will have to look at exactly how the people were approached and what opportunities they were given, and wherever you changed your mind afterwards, you have to go back to the same people. Now, what was happening now when they decided to change the mandate that was given to them by the National Assembly was to just ask for a few written submissions again.
Sure.
So there's no real public participation for something as crucial as custodianship.
Absolutely. And Malusi, as Werner said earlier, one of the big things that the court will look at when they're looking at the importance of public participation is the impact that a piece of legislation has on actual people. I know that you've recently dealt with the Johannes case in the city. And so it just shows you how far-reaching such amendments will have on people. And essentially, there's a human interest story here where the Johannes family was finally being able to have title over their land.
Yes, and I mean, they were dispossessed of that land way back through the Land Act of 1913, and we have managed to restore it as a city of Cape Town. That family, I mean, the big smiles were on their faces in the past week, and they were doing agriculture on that piece of land, and now they were excited because they're going to now develop that particular land parcel. Also, 770 families who were removed from Dido Valley in Simonstown. And it's one of the projects that we are extremely excited about as a city of Cape Town, because those people were also dispossessed and taken from Leolo and Red Hill to places like Kukuletu and Langa. As DA government, we have restored their dignity. We have given them their pieces of land where they were removed, and that is part of our land reform. And as I was saying earlier, we are hell-bent on making sure that we're doing what is correct and proceeding with land reform that is constitutional. And we feel that there is no need for us to change the constitution in its current form. We are able to deliver and make sure that people are restored with their dignity.
And I mean, and these are real impact. These are families, I mean, like you say, the Simonstown case, the Johannes case, these are real families who, through apartheid spatial planning, had lost, or even through the 1913 Land Act, had lost almost everything. And now you are able to demonstrate that even outside a constitutional amendment, if you actually have the political will, you can change things.
Precisely, because it's all about the political will and the commitment thereof. And these families now, they're happy, and we handed over their title deeds to them. It was not a lip service. And now it's upon themselves to make a determination of what they want to see in their properties. We are continuing as the city of Cape Town through as DA government to make sure that we give people back what they've been dispossessed of.
Absolutely. John, I want to come to you. I mean, as the leader of the DA, a lot of people, I mean, a lot has been said in the summit about, where the legal pitfalls are, where the parliamentary pitfalls are, what people on the ground are saying. What do you want to say to people who are saying, of course, you've now highlighted what is wrong, but what are you going to do about it? Can we trust the DA to actually be the constitutionalists that they talk about, protecting our constitution and our rights?
Of course, and I think that one only needs to look at the track record that we have in this regard. Every single time the Constitution's been threatened, it's been the DA that's been at the forefront of ensuring that it is protected and defended. Whether it's fighting poor appointments, whether it's opposing cadre deployment, whether it's standing up for people's right to own firearms, whether it's trying to stop the country from the ANC and the IEC from colluding to stop an election from taking place. All of these things in Kandla matter. The DA has been at the forefront of all of this. I don't think we get nearly enough credit. I mean, I was quite amazed to read Adrian Besson's analysis that the DA is not on the cutting edge of issues. I think that if you look at every single piece of national interest, the DA is front and center in protecting and defending and upholding the constitutional rights, because we believe so fundamentally that it is the only way we can safeguard our democracy, safeguard the rights of citizens, but also ensure the democratic future of South Africa, which is obviously very, very important to us. And I've said to many, many public meetings that while there's breath in my body and blood in my veins, we're going to do everything we can to stop this madness around Section 25. the ill effects of which have been well ventilated so far today, and ensure that citizens' democratic and constitutional rights are protected and not amended, because the consequences for South Africa, the consequences for our people are so significant. So we will always be there on the front line, defending and protecting the Constitution. And we've never walked out on it before, and it's not going to happen now.
And of course, John, and I want you to reflect just on that one issue that you've said, that one of the things is that we sometimes come under fire for people saying, why can't you just let it go? I mean, it's not that big of a deal. But even with the IEC case, for instance, we're talking about precedent. And this is some of the things that I've come across here, that, of course, tinkering with the Bill of Rights sets a dangerous precedent. And it sets us on a slippery slope. And that's why we keep protecting the Constitution the way that we do.
Yeah, I mean, believe you me, going to court is expensive. And I think there's many things we could use that money for as well. But it is so vital, because when those dominoes fall, it's impossible to put them back up again. And further down the line, we'll be dealing with the consequences of those fallout. So it's better to stop the fallout up front. So yes, we have to go to court. We have to spend money on going to court to uphold and protect the Constitution. Because as we've seen in many of the examples that you've spoken about today, places like Venezuela, Cuba, Zimbabwe, everywhere where these mad nationalization and expropriation policies have been tried, it was the falling of the dominoes beforehand that was not stopped. And then by the time communities and citizens and the country woke up, the devastation had already been caused, and they were on a single track towards a failed state. We've got to stop those dominoes from falling right from the get-go, which is why we don't wait around to see what happens. We get things done by getting involved early and making sure that we can put that flag in the sand and be that roadblock to stop this populist train from just trying to get to its destination of a failed state. We don't want that. We don't want to see it. It's not in the interest of the country or its people for that to take place.
Absolutely. And thank you very much, Annelie. Thank you, my Lucy, John and Gwen on Zoom. We'll be back after this.
The fight for various organizations against expropriation of land without compensation continues.
Expropriation of land is a thorny issue. Agri-SA is warning that changing Section 25 of the Constitution to allow this could have a detrimental impact on food production and security.
The Institute of Race Relations is of the view that land expropriation without compensation will stunt the growth of the South African economy and undermine the democracy. The expropriation of land without compensation is a great cause for concern. According to a study conducted by Free Market Foundation, the proposal is already doing damage to the economy. The study found that even if the Constitution were to be amended, government will not hand over land to the needy, but possibly keep it for themselves.
The ANC government has made it very clear that they do not have South African citizens' best interests at heart. Rather, they want to solidify their own power and rob us of our freedoms, and that we cannot allow. It does give me great hope to see so many organizations and political parties and individuals come together to form a united front against this ever-encroaching totalitarian machine.
Be careful that we do not throw out the good with the bad, and that we do not take on board radical and destructive ideas that will set us back several years.
I think the South African public would do very well to rally against this bill.
In recent years, we've seen a raft of laws that propose to change the constitutional compact on which democratic South Africa was founded. The ANC is proposing the nationalization of healthcare, which will take away your right to choose which medical practitioner you go to. They are centralizing police services and taking away citizens' rights to own guns for the purpose of self-defense. And now, government is pushing to amend Section 25 of the Constitution, which threatens your right to own property. Civil society groups have been at the forefront of fighting for citizens' rights and uniting people around a common constitutional cause. If we as South Africans stand any chance of protecting our fundamental rights from a government intent on stripping us of them, we will need to stand together. We're joined now in studio by Dr. Lotriet again, as well as Annette Steyn and Noko Masipa. We're also joined on Zoom by Ernst Roots from AfriForum, Chris Hutton from the Free Market Foundation, Annelies Crosby from Agri SA, and John Rankin, the Northwest Chairperson of the Transvaal Landbouunie. You're watching the last segment of the Land Summit hosted by the DA, and we've come to the point where we have to take stock of what has been said up to this point. So we know now that there's about 10 million hectares of government land that is not being used for the purposes of land reform. That's an estimation. We know that the constitutional process to change Section 25 is fundamentally flawed, and that can have implications for the validity of the entire process. And also, we know that South Africans are more concerned about urban land, about having land in cities close to places of work and opportunity than they are necessarily about agricultural land, which makes sense because South Africa is an urbanized society. So I want to welcome our panelists, and I want to start to give each of our outside representatives, Ernst, Annelies, Chris and John, an opportunity to give their assessment of what they've heard to this point, and just to generally make their statement on the Section 25 issue. Ernst, can we start with you?
Yes, well, thank you, Celia, and thank you for having me on this discussion. I think this is very important. We should be having these discussions. I've been online for a while now listening to the discussions, and I think maybe a broad comment from my side and from AfriForum's side is if we talk about the debate about land reform and expropriation without compensation, I think the arguments against EWC and for the protection of property rights, the arguments are very strong, and we've developed these arguments. These arguments have existed obviously for a long time, but in response to this policy idea, this policy position, a lot of time and effort has been spent on drafting reports. We've done this as AfriForum. We've contracted experts in the field to draft reports for us. We have drafted reports which we haven't published yet and will do soon. And I know many other organizations, including all the other panelists here, have done the same. So I think the arguments are very solid. And something that stood out to me in the discussion we've had so far, or you've had with before this panel discussion, is the frustration about the fact that these good arguments fall on deaf ears. And that's unfortunately the reality in South Africa, and in a way the reality in the world, you could say, but even more so in South Africa, that you can come with a very strong argument about why property rights ought to be protected, and you will win the debate if there is a debate. But that doesn't mean that you would necessarily convince an ANC member of parliament. That's at least our frustration about the situation, and you might convince one or two individuals, but you're not going to convince the party. And that is partly because the fact that the ANC as an organization or as a ruling party is not driven really by having a good argument is not really a big priority for them. Their priority is having a national democratic revolution, getting more power to the government. There's a bunch of other stuff or variables that they regard as higher priorities. And I think we should be discussing the good arguments to conclude, and we should shape and develop our arguments, but we should be talking more about what are we going to do out there to put more pressure on government, to make it unavoidable for them, or to make it impossible for them to continue with this, regardless of only having good arguments.
Thanks, Ernst. Annelies Crosby from Agri SA, can you give us your insights and your views on the issue?
Thank you very much. Yeah, as somebody who's been involved in this land issue and all the debate surrounding it for 26 years now, it's very frustrating. But also, I think it allows one to stand back and sort of have an understanding of how we got to where we are now. And I mean, Agri-SA has been engaging government on the land issue even prior to 1994. I can still remember, our involvement in the constitutional making process in 1996 when the present formulation of the Constitution was being finalized. And over the years, we've sat in so many fora. We spent so much time putting plans forward, trying to engage government on their various plans. I mean, there was that 3-year NAREG process that Minister Nkwinti had. We had the Operation Pakisa, where people were literally sitting day in and out for a couple of months, coming up with plans. And I'm not just talking about, organized agriculture or landowners. These were collectives of groupings of landless people and trade unions and government officials, everybody. And they were good plans that were formulated, but none of them were ever implemented successfully. And now we've had all these reports. I think John has referred to the high-level panel report. I think that is the most authoritative report on land reform in South Africa. But also others, the DPME have brought out reports on land reform. To some extent, the presidential panel advisory panel report, they've all pointed to the fact that the big failure is a failure of implementation. So what's been happening over all of these years, their policies and programs, most of them are good, they can be implemented, but they are implemented so poorly, and there's so much corruption creeping into all of this. And then rather than fixing those policies and programs, they discard it, and then government comes up with new policies. And now I think they've started running out of policies, and now we've come to the point where the Constitution is actually being targeted. And I agree 100% with everybody that it is very clear, and it was also clear from the high-level panel report and some Constitutional Court judgments that the Constitution and Section 25 is not the problem. The problem is the lack of proper budgeting. I mean, we've talked about the budgeting. It's ever since 1994, in no single year has government budgeted more than 1% of the national budget towards land reform. The corruption, the inability of the department to implement these programs. I mean, just look at the Mwelaze judgment by the Constitutional Court, where a special master has now been appointed to oversee the department to make sure that they actually implement the labour tenancy legislation. It's just absolutely chaotic, and amending the Constitution is not going to fix any of that. It's not going to assist anybody. But what is more concerning is that it is going to have a lot of very, very negative unintended consequences. I mean, we had that study done by Dr. Roelof Botha on the economic impact of the expropriation without compensation. And he pointed out that it will have a very negative effect on capital formation. And without capital formation, there's no growth in our economy. But just the last point, I think the thing that I'm probably most concerned about at this point in time is this whole custodianship issue. I mean, expropriation without compensation is very, very serious. But as far as I'm concerned, the custodianship thing is even more serious, because that will mean that permitting and licensing will become the norm. Government may not necessarily own the land outright, but they will be able to dictate what you can do on that land, and you will need a license or a permit, similarly to what is being done with minerals and with water in South Africa, to be able to use your property. And our members certainly will not be able to continue farming if that is the dispensation that they have to farm in.
Yeah. Thanks, Annelies. Chris Hatting, Free Market Foundation, can you just give us your views very quickly on what has been said at the summit up to this point?
Thank you very much, Celia, and to the Democratic Alliance for inviting us for the opportunity. I think it's been an excellent summit. I've greatly enjoyed getting to listen to a wide range of views and perspectives and solutions being offered for the land reform and restitution question in South Africa. It shows you, it cuts across racial lines, religion, backgrounds, socio-economic class, all that kind of thing. It shows you that South Africans of all stripes are concerned about properly solving the country's problems, one of them being land reform. And in my view, and I would argue in the Foundation's view, expropriation without compensation aims to be a shortcut which wants to quote-unquote solve the land reform issue, but doesn't actually want to do the hard work of proper land reform plans which can be implemented, which the Foundation, for example, does in our Kaya Lam title deed program. I think in some ways it gives me hope that so many people have participated today. It shows me that they want to solve the country's problems. In another way, I hope that we can continue the momentum and keep pressing it forward. Regardless of what happens with the vote, for example, we should not think that this is the end of the fight. I think we should see this as the beginning of the fight if the amendment to Section 25 proceeds.
And then lastly, before we get stuck in the conversation, John Rankin, Transvaalse Landbou-Unie.
Goeiedag, baie dankie vir die geleentheid om hier te kan gesels.
Baie welkom.
Wat my baie positief maak is dat ons almal op dieselfde bladsy is en dit maak mense regtig positief as ons na hierdie ding luister. Wat ons as boer, ek is nou 'n boer in die Noordweste en wat ons bekommerd maak baie kere is wat wil die regering doen as hulle nou hiermee suksesvol is. Ons sien dat die landbou is maar 2 na 3% van die land se ekonomie. So as hulle nou al die grond vat en dit uitdeel vir die mense, wat gaan die voordeel wees vir die sosio-ekonomiese probleem wat ons tans in die land het? En dit voel vir my of ons 'n probleem raak sien, maar nie die regte oplossing daarvoor soek nie. Baie dankie.
Dankie John. Ernst, ek wil begin met wat jy voorheen genoem het, dat die ANC verstaan nie noodwendig argumente nie, maar hulle verstaan mag. En hulle verstaan as die balans van mag kantel teen hulle. Veral, so dit is 'n belangrike uitdaging om 'n wysiging in die grondwet te bewerkstellig of te beskerm wat reeds daar is. Nou, een van die goed wat julle gedoen het is om uit te reik na internasionale organisasies, julle te beroep op internasionale gesag. Wat is die strategie daar agter en werp dit vrugte af?
Ja, dis ek dink 'n goeie vraag. Wel, eerstens dink ek is belangrik om te sê dat ons moenie naïef wees en dink dat buitelandse skakeling gaan vir ons die silver bullet wees wat ons probleme gaan oplos nie. Ons dink wel dit is 'n belangrike deel van die legkaart van wat ons veronderstel is om te doen, om druk toe te pas. En 'n interessante manier om jou vraag te beantwoord is, ek onthou in 2012 was ek die eerste keer namens AfriForum by 'n VN-funksie in New York waar ons oor van die uitdagings in Suid-Afrika gepraat het en daar het 'n redelike senior persoon van die VN, 'n werknemer daar met my, hy het my so op my een kant toe getrek en met my kom gesels en gesê, ons moet net onthou, Suid-Afrika word beskou as 'n wonderwerk in die res van die wêreld en dit wat hier gebeur het in die vroeë 90's en die ANC word beskou as die organisasie wat daai wonderwerk bewerkstellig het en die ANC word geassosieer met Nelson Mandela. En die wêreld, dit is 'n bepaalde beeld wat die wêreld het oor wat in Suid-Afrika aan die gang is. En sy woorde aan my toe was, hulle kan sien daar's krake besig om te ontwikkel in hierdie prentjie, maar dit gaan 'n groot opdraande pad wees vir ons as ons die Suid-Afrikaanse regering of meer spesifiek die regerende partye in Suid-Afrika wil ontbloot. En as 'n mens dit nou vergelyk met vandag en ons ervarings vandag in die buiteland, mense hoef nie, ons is verlang al verby die punt waar ons mense in die buiteland moet oortuig, Suid-Afrika het 'n krisis, die Suid-Afrikaanse regering weet nie wat hy doen nie, hy's besig om hierdie land in 'n afgrond in te bestuur. Dis amper tydmors om dit eers vir iemand so te moet verduidelik, want mense kan dit klaar sien. Ons belewenis is mense het, ek praat nou nie noodwendig van mense op straat wat nou nie ingelig is nie, ek praat van navorsers en mense wat met buitelandse sake werk in byvoorbeeld Amerika of Europa en so voorts, is dat hulle het 'n goeie skets van wat in Suid-Afrika gebeur, maar daai skets is nie mooi ingekleer nie. Bedoelende, hulle het baie vrae en 'n interessante vraag wat ons nog al 'n paar keer gekry het is, help ons om te verstaan, hoe gebeur dit dat die EFF, wat eintlik 'n klein party is in 'n sekere sin, die die stryd dikteer. Hoe is dit so maklik vir die EFF om vir die ANC voor te skryf wat hulle moet doen en wat hulle moet sê? En dis eintlik 'n belangrike vraag. Maar ek dink die rede waarom dit vir ons belangrik is wel. So eerstens net om jou vraag te antwoord, dit ons beleef dat daar 'n ontwaking is, dat daar 'n bewuswording is oor wat in Suid-Afrika gebeur. Die rede hoekom dit vir ons belangrik is ons wil nie hê, ek dink nie ons houding moet wees dat ander lande moet ons probleme kom oplos nie. Ons wil nie hê Amerika of een of ander regering moet hier invlieg en nou kom eise stel nie, maar dit is 'n belangrike manier om druk toe te pas. Die ANC val is nie gewoond aan internasionale kritiek nie en ons het dit al gesien. En wanneer hulle daai kritiek kry, is hulle nogal geneig om te skrik. En dit behoort ten minste een van die stukke gereedskap in ons gereedskapskissie te wees om hierdie ding mee te benader.
Ja, so stukke gereedskap. Annelies Crosby, 'n ander manier om dit seker te beskryf is skietgoed om die grondwet te beskerm. Een van die skietgoed wat julle het, wat jy na verwys het natuurlik, is Dr. Rolof Botha se assessering van die ekonomiese impak van 'n verandering van artikel 25. Hoe dink jy gaan julle daai kan gebruik en hoe ver is julle bereid om hierdie stryd te voer om eiendomsreg in Suid-Afrika te beskerm?
Ja, nee, ek meen daai studie is maar een van die goed wat ons gedoen het. Ons het in 2017 het ons byvoorbeeld 'n grondaudit saam met Landbou Weekblad en Agri Development Solutions gedoen. Wat ons vir die regering gesê het, kom sit en praat met ons oor hierdie resultate. En ons het hulle nog nooit tot by 'n tafel gekry nie, want dit stem nie heeltemal ooreen met die grondaudits wat hulle nou al gedoen het nie. Ons het ook daai Bella beraad gehad in 2018 wat ons beste praktyk op die tafel geplaas het en gesê dit is hoe grondhervorming in die praktyk kan werk. Ons moet meer hiervan doen. Ons is deel van hierdie gemengde finansieringsgesprekke wat heelwat belofte inhou, maar ook nou alweer maande agterstallig is met die implementering. So, maar wat jou vraag aanbetref, weet ons is gereed om hof toe te gaan op hierdie ding. As dit blyk dat dit deurgevoer word, dat dit wel deurgestem word, het ek geen twyfel dat ons die howe sal nader nie. Ons het 'n senior regspan wat ons al baie lank al raadpleeg en ons kyk na verskillende aspekte van die prosedurele goed wat hier genoem is, maar ook na die substansie, onder andere na die internasionale konteks, want ons is definitief uit met die internasionale menseregte instrumente en beste praktyk rondom onteiening en vergoeding met dit waarmee ons nou besig is.
En natuurlik as dit kom by die gesprekke by daai internasionale instellings, dan lyk dit vir my asof georganiseerde landbou, sover Agri SA betref, hulle beste gedoen het om uit te reik na die regering toe en alternatiewe te kry vir onteiening sonder vergoeding.
Ja, nee, dis korrek. Soos ek sê, ons het 'n holistiese plan in 2014 voorgestel by ons kongres, wat minister Nkwinti so opgewonde was, hy het die kongres bygewoon. En hy het daar en dan gesê, ja nee, hy stem saam. En daar het net mooi niks van gekom nie. Daai holistiese plan gaan ons nou hersien by ons komende kongres. Maar dit is ongelukkig die probleem wat jy het. Dus ons kry ook deure, dis nie dat ons nie toegang het nie. Ons het baie keer baie goeie gesprekke, planne wat goed ontvang word, maar as dit kom by die uitvoering daarvan, dan gebeur dit dood eenvoudig nie. En dan bou die frustrasies maar weer op en dan word daar weer na politieke oplossings gesoek.
Chris Hutting, from the Free Market Foundation, I just want to pick up something about what you said about handing out title deeds. Because as important as it is to protect Section 25 and the principle of constitutional property rights, it's also important to make sure that more and more people have got a stake in the property market that they would want to protect. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sally, ek is bly jy het my nie daai vraag in Afrikaans gevra nie, want my tegniese Afrikaans is nie so goed as my Engels nie, so dankie vir dit. Yeah. Just on the title deeds point, and this is often said that you know people in South Africa are passionate about the land and their ancestors and what they've owned in their communities, and you see this in the title deed ceremonies because we facilitate the process. We don't sponsor the title deeds on our own. That's done by businesses and individuals and business people, businessmen and women who show that they're serious about positive economic transformation in the country, not the negative radical economic transformation that unfortunately comes from the ruling party and others associated with them. So when you see the handover of the title deed and that people have lived in a home for generations, for years, that they can now hand that over to their children, their grandchildren, to their families, you see how important it is to them to have that stake they realize, I would argue this is the case around the world, they realize the importance of passing on wealth and property to future generations, that we build for the future. It's very easy to tear down, which I would argue policies like EWC, the NHI, prescribed assets, all of these have in mind. They tear down. They don't have in mind the work that is needed to build wealth for future generations. So I think the title deed program, both in the Kaya Lam format, which we do, and which municipalities and parties do in other cities around the country, are vitally important. Just another important aspect that I think I could highlight is the Subdivision of Land Act and how that's tied to the title deed process. If we can amend or repeal the Subdivision of Land Act, which makes it impossible for farmers and tenants of farms to own property, I think that would be another very important step in both to counter EWC, but also to show that those of us who are in favor of property rights and economic prosperity have the right solutions in mind.
And that was a point that was made by Martin van Staden from Sakelige as well. John Rankin, ek wil net by jou aansluit. Ek wou aanvanklik gevra het, wat is die effek van hierdie hele debat op die dag-tot-dagse bedrywighede van boere? Veral gewone familieboere en nie groot landbouorganisasies, korporasies nie. Ek dink dit bly steeds 'n belangrike vraag, maar Ernst het 'n ander dimensie oopgemaak om te sê, wat nou belangrik is nie net argumente nie, maar effektiewe aksie om hierdie verandering, die wysiging van die grondwet te voorkom en eiendomsregte oor die algemeen te beskerm. Wat sal jou kommentaar wees op daai punt?
Ek stem met hom heeltemal saam. Ek dink die meeste boere gaan aan met sy besigheid soos gewoonlik, en dis die meeste boere se manier om te regeer hier ook. Maar ek stem met Ernst saam dat om die regering te oortuig met jou argumente is baie moeilik. Ek dink hulle het 'n ideologiese ding wat hulle najag. Ons moet dalk probeer, soos hy sê, die debat in Suid-Afrika verander. Ons moet die debat kry om werkloosheid op te los. Ons moet die debat kry om ekonomiese groei te kry. Dit is ons probleme in hierdie land en ek dink ons regering of die ANC konsentreer op verkeerde plekke op die stadium en hulle mors ons tyd en almal se tyd met 'n ding wat nooit gaan werk nie.
Annelies, ons het gehoor van burgerlike samelewingsorganisasies, georganiseerde landbou en dies meer. Hoe belangrik is dit vir al hierdie organisasies om saamgesnoer te word in die stryd om eiendomsregte te beskerm en wat doen die DA om 'n bydrae te maak tot so 'n samehorigheid?
Celia, ek wil eerstens net baie dankie sê vir ons deelnemers vandag, want as dit nie vir hulle was nie, het ons baie meer gesukkel. So ek dink dit is juist die antwoord. Ons moet nou almal saam staan. Dit help nie dat elke burgerlike organisasie nou op sy eie die stryd probeer stry nie. En dis waar ons nou ook al betrokke is by van hierdie organisasies, belangegroepe waar ons uit verskillende belange uitkom, maar wat ons praat en ons het eensstemmigheid oor die feit dat ons kan nie toelaat dat artikel 25 gewysig word nie, en dat ons ook nie kan toelaat dat daar onteiening sonder vergoeding is nie. So ja, dit is, ons probeer uitreik, ons probeer deurlopend hierdie organisasies op hoogte hou. Annelies het verwys na navorsing wat hulle doen, Ernst het verwys na navorsing, dit is goed wat ons hand sterk in ons proses. Wat ek miskien ook wil byvoeg, en daar's verwys na die internasionale gemeenskap en druk wat uitgeoefen word. Die DA het self na vir die afgelope klompie maande, het ons kontak met diplomate van verskillende lande, ons het kontak met parlementariërs of parlementariërs in die verskillende lande. Inteendeel, ons het nou so ver gekom dat ons in die House of Commons van die Verenigde Koninkryk het ons vrae ingedien deur een van die lede daar. juis oor onteiening sonder vergoeding. So ons is in daai opsig ook besig om die internasionale gemeenskap bewus te maak. Natuurlik gaan hulle nie inkom en alles kom red nie. Maar ek dink tog as ons fokus byvoorbeeld op die ekonomiese impak, op hulle eie beleggings, begin dit dalk net die regering op 'n ander manier laat dink. Maar weer eens, hierdie is 'n geleentheid en ek dink hierdie beraad wat ons vandag ook het, waar ons mense bymekaar kry, is een van ons pogings om te sê, maar ons moet nou saam staan. Ons moet nou mekaar se hande vat.
Annette Stein, if we look at the belanghebbendes, the interested parties, they've got a stake in this issue. We often overlook, although not at the summit, the folks who farm on land or have land and have leasehold title, or not even in some instances proper lease agreements in place. I mean, they've been begging government, please give me an option to purchase, please give me proper leasehold so that I can plan for the future. Talking about that interest group in particular, just update us on the issue of Ivan Klute, who is also one of the folks whose case you took up.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much. I'm thinking in Afrikaans now.
Jy kan Afrikaans praat, dis reg.
My tegniese Engels is beter as my So now let me speak in English. As I said earlier, and I think you mentioned it, earlier this year I asked the Minister of Agriculture how much agricultural land does the Department of Land Reform have under custodianship. So they are the owners of the land. It's 9.8 million hectares. Now, everyone on that 9.8 million hectares, or most of them, don't have a lease agreement. So they're living from month to month wondering if they're going to be there next month. We have seen last year the examples of farmers while we were in lockdown and officials worked from home, sending out letters to farmers to say that they must vacate the land for no reason at all. So Ivan Klute, I think, grabbed the highlights of everyone and the imagination of the country, but there's hundreds of other people like Ivan Klute. Now, Ivan today does not have a lease agreement. This after commitment by commitment from even the president to say that it will immediately be rectified. The reason why government is not even going so far to giving people a lease agreement, not even title to their land, is unclear. The only thing that I can think of is that they want to keep people dependent on the state. And Ivan Klute and people like David Ragazzi is very, very brave to stand up and fight against the government. Most people say, please fight for me, but don't mention my name. And that is scary. And that makes me angry. Because they know if they stand up and fight the government, tomorrow they will be off the land.
But it's good, Annette, we know when you're angry, you also work much harder from experience. Noko Masipa, you have a history in agriculture. You're now a DA Member of Parliament, member of the Portfolio Committee on Agriculture. I know that you speak to a lot of farmers, both established farmers, upcoming farmers. What do they say to you, the kind of support they require from government, not related to junking constitutional property rights?
Yeah, I always say that, emerging farmers don't have complex, requests. They're not really making complex demands to the government. And also, let me just say that commercial farmers are also interested party in terms of ensuring that the land reform takes place and it takes place successfully. However, there are challenges. And the first impediment is water rights. If you look in the last 27 years, South Africa has only managed to build 2 dams. The apartheid government, in 50 years, they managed to build 40 dams. So our government is actually the impediment of ensuring that we have got a successful land reform. The government under Nkwinti came with a 50-50 plus to say, let's go into 50-50 and assist. And Commercial farmers came out and say, you know what, we're prepared to offer the land, but give us water so that we can assist this emerging farmers in terms of, accessing land and making sure that it's productive. That did not happen. So that's number one. So the other thing, obviously, is the capital impediment. So we've got programs after programs, as Annelie Crosby has just indicated, that government introduces policy, but the implementation is the problem. We've got blended finance, which we were hopeful, because if you look at AFC, you look at the World Bank, they're implementing this blended finance because they realize that governments all over the world, they don't have enough fiscus to ensure that they implement, all the projects that they want to do. So at the moment, the blended finance has now been moved from, it's supposed to be housed at Land Bank, is now at IDC. And we know IDC's manufacturing is high level, so the emerging farmers are now on their own. They're not getting any support. So capital requirements is a big problem for many of the farmers. The last point that I just want to make is that the extension services is a big problem. In my past life, I came across a farmer who was being assisted by the government, with 2 million year after year. And at that point, the government was saying, we have assisted this guy with 10 million. He hasn't shown anything. But the requirement of that farm was about 10 million, production input cost. The Land Bank was not prepared to assist him. The national government was not prepared to assist him. So I sat with the farmer, and then after we have agreed that he go into recapitalization program, he agreed we went into recapitalization. When we got into recapitalization program, he needed to get a commercial farmer. He got the commercial farmer who came in on board in terms of really ensuring that, they plant the farm. Last year, as I'm speaking, the farmer has managed to have his first proper harvest. So the extension services play a very critical role. So the challenge that we are sitting with is our government has got policies, unfortunately, but they lack the implementation. Like I said initially when we were in this studio that, your constitution is the strategy. But if you do not have the proper structure underneath, that constitution is not going to save you, it's not going to help you. And this is where we are sitting.
And while we are stuck arguing about the constitution, there are critical things not being done.
Not being done.
Sure. I want to take the conversation back to the civil society representatives. Ernst, ons het die gesprek begin met verwysing na wat kan ons doen om die magsbalans te skuif? Ons het gesprek gehad oor internasionale druk, wat julle doen en wat ons doen. Wat kan nog gedoen word om seker te maak dat die situasie, soos wat hy tans is, die grondwet beskerm word? Veral gegeewe die feit dat dit lyk nie asof op die huidige oomblik asof die ANC en die EFF mekaar kan vind nie.
Ja, wel as daar 'n eenvoudige, maklike antwoord was, dan dink ek was dit al klaar gedoen. Die antwoord is waarskynlik 'n kombinasie van goed. Om 'n voorbeeld te gee, iemand wat ek onlangs ontmoet het wat 'n organisasie van die grond af wil kry het vir my so rukkie terug 'n boodskap gestuur en gevra of ons kan help fasiliteer dat die persoon 'n publieke debat met Julius Malema het, want hy wil die EFF ontbloot vir hulle idees. Ek het nog geantwoord en gesê dit gaan nie gebeur nie. Jy kan hom uitdaag tot 'n debat, maar hy gaan net nie ja sê nie. Hy gaan net nie ja antwoord nie. En my advies aan die persoon was, as jy hom wil ontbloot, dan moet jy 'n organisasie bou wat sterker is as sy organisasie, wat meer steun het as sy organisasie. Ek dink ons leef in 'n land veral waar die werklikheid van magsdinamika baie sterk is. En ek dink die belangrikste om te doen, ons filosofie ten minste, is dat die heel belangrikste ding om te doen is om instellings te bou. En instellings in die breë sin van die woord, dit sluit in om goed funksionerende takke te hê op grondvlak, om goed funksionerende instellings te bou, jou eie, byvoorbeeld, dit kan insluit jou eie vermoë om te kommunikeer, soos wat ons hier vandag doen, dis 'n vorm van 'n instelling eintlik wat die DA bou. om as mens oor veiligheid praat, om funksionerende buurtwagte te hê, om seker te maak die goed is georganiseer en om op grondvlak steen te werf. Ons leef in 'n wêreld waar ons almal vasgevang word op 'n manier in sosiale media, en Flip Buys, wat die voorsters van AfriForum, het 'n goeie aanhaling daaroor. Hy sê altyd om baie likes te hê op Facebook is soos om baie geld te hê in Monopoly. Dis lekker, maar dis nie die regte wêreld nie, dis nie die regte lewe nie. En ons moet in die regte lewe op grondvlak in gemeenskappe organiseer, met mense gesprekke voer. Ons moet internasionaal gaan, ons moet steenwerf, en ons moet instellings bou. En instellings kan verskeie goed wees. Dit kan 'n plaaslike tak insluit, dit kan 'n privaat universiteit wees, dit kan 'n verskeidenheid van forme aanneem.
Annelies Crosby, of course, organized agriculture in this country is a very strong institution that was just mentioned by Ernst. You would build strong institutions. Have you got hope for winning this battle over property rights and preserving the Constitution despite everything that's happened?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's always hope. And I mean, we have to be prepared to go the whole way and go to the courts if that is what it takes. But we also need to win the hearts and minds of the ordinary South Africans, the consumers who are eating the food that our farmers are, for the most part, producing, and that are being sold lies in terms of what is really going to make a difference in their lives. I mean, they're being sold this lie that if the Constitution is amended, their lives will be better. They will have land, they will have food, and they will be economically better off, and it's not the case. So we must just keep on trying to really get the facts out there, put the reality on the table, and win the hearts and minds of ordinary South Africans.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Annette Steyn, I want you just to comment on what you've heard from these representatives of civil society organizations, especially do you have hope and optimism for the future that not only will we protect property rights, but we will expand the property stake of ordinary South Africans by a big exponent?
Verseker Celie, ek dink nie een van ons sou vandag hier gesit het as ons nie hoop gehad het nie. Wat my ook positief maak is dat meer en meer Suid-Afrikaners sien wat ons doen. Meer en meer mense besef waarmee ons besig is. En ek dink ons moet net almal doen wat ons besig is om te doen. Soos ek net nou gesê het, ek werk met swart, jonger Suid-Afrikaners, jong mense wat 'n toekoms in hierdie land wil soek, mense wat begin besef. Wat beteken dit? Waarvoor beklei ons as ons praat van property rights? Ek sal nooit vergeet nie. Dit was omtrent 5-6 jaar terug wat ek eendag onder 'n boom gesit het in rural Oos-Kaap. Toe vra van die jonger mense my, dit was gedurende verkiesingstydperk, hoekom het wit boere plase soos hulle het en ons nie? En ons die gesprekke daar begin voer het. En toe het ek eintlik vir die eerste keer begin besef, die meeste Suid-Afrikaners besef nie wat property rights beteken nie. En die gesprekke begin aanvat. So as mens vandag kyk, dit is nie eers regtig meer nodig om dit te verduidelik aan die meeste mense. En die mense begin dit besef. So ek dink ons is op die regte pad en ons gaan die ding maak werk.
There you have it, an optimistic note towards the end of the Land Summit hosted by the DA. Thank you very much for your participation in this. Please stay tuned for the concluding remarks to our summit. Thank you for watching the largest online land summit in South Africa, proudly hosted by the DA.
And thank you to everyone who participated in this important discussion. From the beginning, we said we wanted to unite people and organizations.
We set out to create a non-partisan event, a summit in the interest of the South African people from all walks of life, different political persuasions, to find common ground.
And what is clear is whether you are Madlamini from Ekonge or Gwabis from Springbok, the issue of property rights is important to us all.
The DA will continue to fight to protect property rights for all South Africans. Until next time.
Stay strong, South Africa.